Hi, I'm Kiki, and I guess I'm making this video about the books that I read this year. You know, it's one of those things where I have so many opinions to share, and I would really love to share them with the internet, and I'm sure they're gonna go down great. I have a lot to talk about. I read a whole lot of books this year, and a whole lot of them were not very good, in my personal opinion, and I'm sure there will be disagreement. Not necessarily in my presence, but it will proceed. This will mostly be a spoiler-free review, but I will be spoiling some of the books, because when I don't recommend a book, I don't care if you don't know about it. I don't think you should read it. Do be aware that if I start a book and I have a rueful expression or a twitch of the lip, that you are about to find out everything about that book and why it sucks. So, enjoy the video. This should be reasonably entertaining, in at least some capacity. I'm going to be talking about a whole bunch of different books in a whole bunch of different genres, so I've separated them into genres for my convenience and hopefully yours. I'll start off by talking about some fantasy books. So, here's our first book, Brandon Sanderson's White Sand, written not by Brandon Sanderson but Rick Hoskin and Isaac Stewart, and illustrated by Fritz Gopez and Julius Gopez and Fritz Casas and Nebese Zitro. This book is a graphic novel, as may be evident already. It was advertised this year that Brandon Sanderson was putting out 5 books instead of his usual, normal 2 or 3. As part of the year of Sanderson, plus the release of Defiant, 5 major books were released this year, which I have not read yet, and I will get to next year. However, that is a lie, because this was the 6th book that was released for the year of Sanderson, and it was not advertised, A, because Dragonsteel's not publishing it, and B, because it was not supposed to come out this year. It was supposed to come out last year, and it was badly delayed. There was a lot of drama surrounding the release of this book. Dynamite, which is the company that published this book, decided to run an Indiegogo campaign for the omnibus, which this is, and it did not proceed smoothly. They ran into various issues with the printers, and at the same time issues with the fans who were mad that the Indiegogo was not moving quickly. By the time that the Indiegogo was still being fulfilled, the Year of Sanderson Kickstarter campaign, which was quite a big deal, had started being fulfilled, and that was of such higher quality than the Dynamite one that the fans started getting a little annoyed, and Dynamite's last few months didn't go well. This book was not very well reviewed by fans, so I have seen. A lot of people just didn't feel like it felt like authentic Sanderson. In my personal opinion, and I have noticed this since Sanderson co-writes books with people all the time, I'm not looking for like the exact same writing style or character style or stuff. I just want the good character development and interesting plot that comes with one of his books. And I feel like this preserves that because the character development and plot are taken from a manuscript that he wrote. I read this book twice. Once in January and once in April, and I enjoyed it a lot. I feel like it does a really good job of showcasing the value in small stories and small power levels. This book is all about how magic can be as flashy or complicated as you want it to be, but it's really your own mastery over it that dictates how much of it is worth anything. And this is also a small story. The world isn't doomed. The country isn't gonna die. It's just about a guy who wants to have a job. And, there's other stuff surrounding that, but I appreciate that the story was kept on a focus that felt very authentic and relatable. If you have read White Sand in the original graphic novel format, which was in 3 books, which are not really available anymore, I would recommend getting the omnibus. There are a whole bunch of new pages. There's like a 20-page new prologue, which focuses on Chris, and at least probably another 20 pages scattered throughout, which are Ars Arcanum pages, which, as you know, if you've read Brandon Sanderson books, that's lore and magic system pages, and these are written by Chris with extra diagrams by Isaac Stewart. So I would highly recommend this, and you could order it. You can see what happens. Dynamite might send you 2 extra copies of the wrong format by accident. Hey, I'm not saying anything happened, but miracles, I guess, occur in a poorly run Indiegogo campaign. If you don't want to order it, be aware that there is a prose version coming eventually, which will make White Sand into an actual proper book. The news just came out as I'm recording this. It's probably going to come out in 2025. So, it's something to look forward to, you know, if you insist on not liking this for some reason. I read these 2 books this year in a series called Edinburgh Nights. This is the first one. The second one I don't have here. I ended up giving it away. I read the first book in March and then the second one in September, which I tend to read books with a large separation between them, but I don't think that was really a big deal here, since it's a very episodic story. These books are quite the genre. I would describe them as a fantasy adventure mystery in future alternate dystopian paranormal Scotland. It's actually a tad overwhelming in how many genres it tries to hit, and sometimes too many combined ideas does not produce the best results. It ends up in having a lot of cool concepts, but not enough time to explore them. While I know that things are dystopian and things kind of suck in these books, I don't really fully understand what's going on. It seems like there's a bad king. Who? Why does everything suck? It seems like maybe there's other stuff going on outside of Scotland, or there were wars or something. Not everything is fully explored. Also, I don't know where the fantasy elements came from. You know, it's just... it's a little bit overwhelming, and that's not necessarily a good thing. While there are several characters in these books, the main character, Ropa, is accompanied by 2 friends, Jomo and Priya, on most of her adventures, and there's also other people who join in sometimes and other characters who are featured. I don't feel like most of the characters get all that much definition. That could just be me, but I feel like I'd like to see more of them. This is complemented, however, because Ropa's character voice is excellent. This entire book is written in Ropa's voice. Just to, I'm looking for an example. It's a very sarcastic, a bit of a future-inspired, and there's a lot of slang that the character uses, but it's pretty understandable for a story written in that kind of tone, and I found it really fun. There is a problem with the soft magic system. These books use a very vague definition of a whole lot of things. You can do a mystery with magic in it. It's hard to do, but you can pull it off, but it's harder to do when the character doesn't understand how the magic works. And because the magic is a part of the mystery, you have to figure out how the magic ties into the mystery, and you can't do that if it's not fully explained. So that's why I was defining this as a bit more of an adventure story. And the sequel also is more of an adventure story, although they present themselves as mysteries. The twist in the first one is pretty obvious. I got it about halfway through the book. But the second one is definitely more obscure and harder to figure it out. But maybe that's just because I don't have financial talents, which, yes, the second book is a financial story, so expect that to be a little different if you choose to read it. The other very minor complaint that I have about these books is that they don't focus enough on their titles. This book is called The Library of the Dead. The Library of the Dead is in this book. It is not heavily featured in this book, it's just around, and it's a place they go sometimes. The second book is called Our Lady of Mysterious Ailments, which you think sounds really strange and interesting to explore. It's just a hospital, and it's where the plot starts, but like there's nothing inherent about the hospital that's weird. It was just a clever name that T.L. Huchu thought was cool. There will be a third book, which I believe is called The Mystery at Dunvegan Manor, or House, or Castle, or something to that effect. I'm probably not going to read it, because the second one didn't really work for me, and I'm looking for a good mystery. But if I was just looking for, like, really fun character voice and adventure stories, I would probably go for it. I read Good Omens this year, and it was underwhelming. I didn't find this book that funny. Maybe it's just not my sense of humor. That's totally possible. That happened to me a lot this year. I guess it's just hard to find things that are my particular sense of humor. Apart from the humor of this book, which I thought was just a little bit too violent for me, and maybe a little dry, except for the fish, which was too wet. The narration was pretty good in this book, but pretty scattered also. There were a lot of characters, and a lot of the characters got different segments of narration, but there wasn't really any one or two particular characters that were followed. Aziraphale and Crowley, correct me if I'm wrong on those pronunciations, seem to generally be regarded as the main characters of this book, but there wasn't really much of either of them in this. I guess I was surprised by that. Even though I hadn't read the book and I didn't watch the TV show beforehand, it just wasn't what I was expecting. The conclusion, though, the conclusion was great. It was really well foreshadowed, and I thought it was super cool. I'm so happy that the story turned out to have that outcome. It was really climactic and awesome. Best part of the book, by far. Otherwise, it was okay. I did try the TV show afterwards. This is not super relevant. I found it even less funny than the book, and so I stopped after the first episode. But I can see how if this made you laugh hysterically, you would enjoy it. The humor did not keep me occupied through the characterization, and the characterization did not keep me occupied through the humor, which was what I was looking for. Oh well. I read a book in December called Hounded, written by Kevin Hearn. It's the first book of, I believe, a 10-book series called the Iron Druid Chronicles. It's about this ancient druid who is living in the modern day and trying to escape from gods and witches and all the different creatures that are chasing him. It's not solely based in Irish mythology, like it's kind of the all mythologies are real, but we're not totally going to explore that kind of subgenre. Which, granted, I could be wrong because I didn't read the later books, but it could get more definition in the future, I'm not sure. I would say it's a decent book, but there were just a couple problems that prevented me from enjoying it to the fullest. And if you can look over those, it could be really fun for you, but for me it just didn't work. First off, the character didn't feel that old. He's supposed to be over 2,000 years old, but he acted modern. And he did this supposedly to blend in, and he was like trying really hard to do it, but he didn't seem like he was trying really hard. He seemed like he was meant to be relatable and effortless. I'm sure there are a lot of interesting things that you could do with an immortal character. I haven't read a lot of stories with this kind of a premise, but this felt like a strange approach, I'll be honest. Also, there's just storytelling problems with having a character who's this old in this well-established of a world. Usually, in this context, the author will do one of two things. One of the things is that they'll just change the character and have a character who is very new to this world and needs everything explained to them so that the lore can be introduced to the reader at the same time. Like, for instance, Percy Jackson is this kind of story. It's about gods and monsters, but Percy is young and he's not used to the whole thing yet. He just got introduced to it. Another thing that you could do, which arguably is the much more obvious option, is you could just tell the story in third person and explain the lore to the reader that way. A lot of fantasy is in third person, so you kind of understand everything that's going on without having to have characters in canon explain it to you. This book did not do either of those. The character narrated his own story in first person, explained, like, kind of the bare minimum of what you needed to know, so that it was followable, but it probably would have been enhanced if I knew a little bit more about Irish mythology. Granted, I knew enough to recognize some of the words, but still not, like, the full amount that I wish I had. There was some sex in this book. I was surprised how much, so if you were not expecting that and you wanted to read this book, be aware of it. I don't know why the main character needs to have sex with so many goddesses. I don't know if it's just something that writers enjoy doing, or if it's a problem. Like, I don't read that many books that are explicit. I'm not really a fan of that kind of thing. So, up to you. There's also some power scaling problems with this book. So, the problems involve the way that the main character's powers are treated compared to the powers of the bad guys and the people he's fighting. You can have a character who's weaker and who uses like some kind of manipulation in order to get their goal, or you can just have a character who uses the power of friendship or something. That didn't really happen here. He's almost completely irrelevant to the actual conflict that's going on in the book and just gets used as a pawn by a couple of different groups. But he, in himself, he is not important. He also happens to be very lucky, and he manages to not die somehow, despite the fact that he totally could have and would have died if a whole sequence of events did not happen. He has some powerful allies, I'll grant him that, but he himself is very underprepared. Now, combined with that, this book included an extra short story in which he killed a bunch of witches who were disturbing this forest in like 3 seconds. So I don't know what the problem is. Maybe Kevin Hearne just needed to figure out how this character could apply his powers in a more productive way. And maybe that will happen in future books, but I don't know because I'm not going to keep reading. Sorry. Also, I kind of have to bring this up. One of the Tuatha De Danann, the Irish gods who's featured in the book, has red hair, and there are 3 normal human Irish characters in the book, and one of them is old enough that she would have gray hair, but the other 2 also have red hair. And it just struck me like, I understand the style choice, it's a fun character design, but you know not all Irish people have red hair, right? Right? Unrelated, but this is the second series that I've read in my life with a dog named Oberon, so I choose to believe that he's the same dog, and he's just traveling universes like the traveling shovel of death. I also read a different Kevin Hearne book in December, Kill the Farm Boy, co-written with Delilah S. Dawson, who I haven't read any of her other work, but I'm sure they're both fairly well-respected fantasy authors from what I can see. I hadn't heard of them before I picked up the books. This book is a humor fantasy book. It's one of those things that like kind of teases the fantasy genre and tries to overturn tropes, but it doesn't really do that. There's a lot of ways that you can poke at the fantasy genre for humor. There are a lot of very entrenched tropes that you can harness for comedy and manipulate in interesting ways, but I think this book was trying a little bit too hard to be funny. Some of the fantasy archetypes, instead of being inverted, ended up getting exaggerated to a little bit of a frustrating and not necessarily fun degree. Fantasy elves are, since Tolkien, have been very stereotyped as being like super graceful and above humanity, and maybe even a little bit snooty or looking down on humanity, and they have the best everything, and they're the best at everything. They're like the best version of humanoids that there could possibly be. And the elves in this book are like that to a degree that's meant to be funny, but I don't know, I always find it funnier when you have like an elf who doesn't live up to those standards and is explicitly like bad at stuff. I think that's cool, and I think it offers more opportunities for character development. But the entire party in this book was humans, so I guess they weren't looking for that anyway. Actually, though, it probably would have added to the problem if they'd chosen to do that, because the characters were way too incompetent in this book. They couldn't get anything done. I won't say who, but there is a part where one character dies in a very stupid way after making a very bad decision, and it's played for laughs, and they just stay dead for the rest of the book. I guess it was kind of funny, but killing a party member for laughs makes the story feel like it's not going to have any kind of success. You get attached to the characters as the story goes on, and of course you want to see them succeed. And ideally, you want it to be by their own merits. But that did not happen in this book. The characters succeeded due to pure chance and making bad decisions. There's this really clever part a little ways into the book where it's established that, like, some of the things that you saw earlier have been recontextualized, and it's been explained who was manipulating them and what they want. And the characters have, like, discovered this secret evil plan, and ideally, they would then figure out how to foil it in a normally built story. But no, these characters just play straight into the evil plan, and it happens exactly as you would think that it did, except for, like, one caveat, which lets them win, which also is a flaw in the plan, and not their success. So, I was a little disappointed by that. There was also a romance in this book, a lovely, I'm tempted to say it was a lovely lesbian romance in this book that was a little bit forced, which makes me very sad. I do think it would have been very cute if it was established better, but as it was, the characters just started giving each other googly eyes, and then 5 chapters later or something, you could tell that they were a couple. And it was like, I don't know why this happened. It didn't feel naturally built. It just felt like a thing that was there to be there, which is really sad. There were a lot of references in this book, and like ways to poke fun at references. The back of the book says we're gonna need a bigger goat. So we already have a reference there that's not really sensical and never actually comes up or makes sense. There's a reference to Wizard of Oz, which I thought was very weird. It just felt out of place. Including some kind of movie reference doesn't make something funny. That's just my opinion. Also, if you're going to include a character who's a goat, maybe I've just been preconditioned to believe this because of Percy Jackson, but the best thing that you can have that goat character do is eat random stuff all the time and make it funny. And the best kind of stuff that you can have this happen with is like aluminum cans or plastic cups. But unfortunately, because this is a story set in medieval time, the goat has to limit himself to things that actually exist, like leather boots, which didn't really have the same amount of inherent funniness to it, in my personal opinion. I'm gonna read the 3rd book in this series since I bought it already, but I don't know if I'm gonna end up reading the 2nd book. I wasn't thrilled with Kevin Hearn, and I wasn't all too thrilled with this particular book, so oh well. I still have these books if anyone wants them. I don't know what I'm going to do with them. They're kind of heavy. They could be decent paperweights. This is the Kingkiller Chronicle, which is a repeatedly acclaimed fantasy series by the author Patrick Rothfuss. This is the entirety of the Kingkiller Chronicle. There is not going to be a book 3. Patrick Rothfuss insists that there will be, but there won't be, and I'll explain why in like 10 minutes. These books are nicely written. They have good prose. It flows well, and I like the descriptions, and it doesn't feel overly flowery, which is really important. Sometimes, after I read a book, it takes me some time to analyze it and go over my feelings with it. And sometimes that can be like really quick, like I can finish a book and think, oh, I like that a lot, or that was not very good. And sometimes it takes me a few days or a few weeks. And these books took me a few weeks. It took me about a month after I finished the 2nd book, The Wise Man's Fear, to realize how terrible these books are in every aspect, except the prose, which is good. I need to talk about so many different problems with these books, but I'll start with the fact that the main character, Kvothe, is not a human. He's not built like a human. He's not built correctly. It doesn't make any sense. The way that he's put together, and his personality and his conflicting personality traits not only don't match each other, but don't match his backstory that we're presented with. The one thing that makes sense is that he's a good musician because he studied to be a good musician. And that is the only thing in these books that solidifies the main character in a good and sensical way. Even though he didn't practice for like 2 years, which can really hurt being a musician. I want to take a moment to talk about who Kvothe is supposed to be versus who he comes across as. Kvothe is supposed to be a very intelligent, talented young man. He's 15 in the first book, I believe, and yet he's admitted to university in order to study magic and chemistry and metallurgy and like a bunch of different things. He has a whole bunch of talents. He knows a lot of the knowledge that this world has at this time. He is very good at music and storytelling, that which makes sense due to his upbringing in a group of traveling performers, and he is smart-mouthed to an infuriating degree. He has no impulse control. Okay, that's not true, because at one point in the book he gets given this poison that removes his impulse control, and then he's slightly worse. But still, him normally is just no breaks, just make whatever decision he thinks is right, even when it doesn't make any sense and ends poorly. Kvothe is built in the same way that I see a lot of bad writers build smart characters. It seems to me that some people don't really understand either like how intelligence works or where it comes from or what people become like when they're unusually intelligent for their age. I have had a lot of interactions with people who are unusually intelligent for their age, and they are not like this, and they are never like they are portrayed in any book or piece of media. Writers seem to have this idea that being a genius, which itself is a word that I don't really like, is basically like being a dipshit who has this magical spirit that possesses you whenever you need to know something. And it's not. Your personality is impacted by your intelligence and your ability to judge the feelings of other people. And in my experience, even if some intelligent people are not necessarily able to figure out how others are feeling, they do care about how other people are feeling, and they do try not to hurt people. They aren't usually selfish. Kvothe is frustrating for me to read because of this mistake, and also because he's not a very relatable character, and also because he repeatedly makes poor decisions that his older self in the framing sequence acknowledges are poor decisions, but still, the magnitude of the poor decisions reverberates throughout all of the characters and the entire world, which is another problem. Very few of the other characters in these books have cohesive personalities. Like, they'll have a few personality traits, they'll have something going on. For instance, I thought Devi is probably one of the best characters in these books, and she's mostly in this one and not very much. But every character who shows up in these books is in some way changed or touched or manipulated or has some kind of strong connection to the main character. There are ways that you can justify this. In the Wheel of Time books, which I'll be talking about later in this video, the characters explicitly have this effect on other people, and it's a world-building reason. If there's a world-building reason for it in these books, go ahead and tell me, because otherwise, this is the literal definition of a Mary Sue. That's right, Kvothe is probably a Mary Sue. The world distorts around him, the characters distort around him, he is the only object of importance in the entirety of what's supposed to be a rich and complicated world. Book 2 has a really serious structure problem. There is basically no plot. This is an 1100-page book, so you would think that would be an easy issue to fix. Instead, the main character starts at university and he does some stuff, and then he goes to this different kingdom and he does some stuff and white knights for some people, and then he goes on this quest to stop some bandits, and he stops the bandits, and then he goes to the Fey realm and does something which I will talk about, trust me. And then he goes on the, like, this study abroad thing. I call it study abroad, even though they don't have study abroad in this world. To this other country and meets this group of people and learns their ways. And then the book basically ends. I mean, I think there's like an epilogue part where he's back at university again. But nothing actually happens in this book. The plot is not advanced. We still don't know basically anything about the Chandrian. He doesn't really know anything more about the Chandrian. I mean, like, their names, but I guess he could use his naming magic, which doesn't really work, in order to figure out stuff about them, or hurt them, or something, which has been his goal since book 1. He's trying to kill them to take revenge on his parents. His goal is not advanced, and these books are called the Kingkiller Chronicles, and we still don't know what king he killed. In fact, if I remember correctly, I don't even think there are kings in either of these books. Because it's all about Kvothe, and nothing that's not relevant to his life is established. The book was fun to read because the prose was good, and you thought it was going somewhere, and then it didn't go anywhere. These books do have one thing going for them, I guess, apart from the prose, and that is that they have cool ideas. Sympathy, the magic system, is a cool idea. The naming magic system is a cool idea. There's some stuff taken from Celtic mythology, which I enjoyed, and it was fun to see some of that. There were also original things, like Dracus instead of dragons, like these big grazer cow things. And there was like a cocaine bear moment with a Dracus in the first book, which was a very fun sequence, even if quite a tense one. The problem with some of the cool ideas is that, especially in the second book, they work at the expense of logic, or reason, or storytelling. I'm going to talk about 2 of these. First off, the tree thing, the Kthe, or Kthi? I don't know how to say it. It's never explained. I don't even think there's a glossary in these books that tells you how to say the words, which would be great, you know. This is a spirit that lives in a tree in the Fey realm, and it is all-knowing and evil. The way that this works, it can see all possible futures, and because it's the only thing that can impact the future, if somebody comes close, it will tell that person whatever it needs to say in order to bring about the worst possible future. I really like this concept. In fantasy, there is usually something to be done with like an ancient villain who is sealed away or defeated at some point, and that caused the world to have some kind of backstory. A lot of different stories do this. It's a very common fantasy staple. I would have really loved it in this story with that bad guy. But no, the bad guy has to be an antagonist in the main story. Kvothe, no matter how much the narrative treats him as a Mary Sue, is completely underleveled for this. Because as I have explained, he isn't actually really smart. He's just a jerk being possessed by a textbook. And so this thing tells him some stuff, and he immediately becomes extremely angry and runs and makes poor decisions which have lasting consequences. By the way, the poor decision that he made was not like hurting somebody. It was this other character, Denna, who is basically a walking plot device for any conceivable situation, which is designed to make her more mysterious, is playing this song for him that she wrote, and it's supposed to be really good, but he doesn't like the lyrics, and he insults her and basically says, "These lyrics suck, the song sucks, goodbye," and she breaks up with him, supposedly, even though they were never officially in a relationship. I guess this has effects. I don't know, maybe we'll see the effects. I don't like that this character is included in a story which has a scope too small for it. It would have been a cool concept in a different story. I'll just leave it at that. Thing number 2 is the Adem people. Like I mentioned, he goes on a study abroad program in the second book to this other country called Adembe? Something to that effect. Ademre. As part of this, he learns the ways of the Adem people, who have a couple of very salient characteristics that seemed extremely weird to me. First off, they don't use facial expressions. Like, it's a cultural thing that you have to keep your face totally blank all the time. And instead they use, like, cues with their hands that have different meanings. They're basically like sign language but dialogue tags, which raises the question, how does sign language work? How you can't sign while you're signing something totally different. So how would you expect that to work? Nonetheless, these people don't use facial expressions, which is weird to me, because if you know about psychology, you know that many studies have shown that facial expressions are a universal human constant. Everybody has facial expressions. It's like an innate thing. It's not cultural. So it strikes me as very strange that this group of people doesn't use facial expressions in this world. Do we get an explanation for this? No. Does it make sense why they wouldn't use facial expressions in their culture? Not really, because otherwise they're very vulnerable. Another thing that's involved with that is that they just, how do I explain this? Everybody has an open relationship. So people sleep with each other all the time, and it doesn't seem to really mean as much as it would in almost every other culture. People sleep with each other randomly so much that women don't think that having children is related to sleeping with a guy. I got a couple of questions here. Do they never notice that children look like their fathers sometimes? Are there no asexual people in this world who just aren't interested in sleeping with people and so don't get pregnant? Why would you write this? Why would you write this? It doesn't make sense. And in fact, you would not be surprised to learn that this is a reason for the main character to get laid. Because so much in this second book is a reason for the main character to get laid. Why is there sex in these books? Don't get me wrong, it's okay to have sex in books. In these books it isn't even like displayed. There's fade to blacks and stuff. Most of the time, I don't care. I just find it mildly annoying and I don't seek out it happening in books. It kind of bores me, to be honest. In this book, it is a problem. It is a problem that deserves to be addressed because, oh my god, maybe I mentioned earlier in this review that at the beginning of the books, the main character is 15. And by the end of the second book, he's like 16 at most. And he's slept with 3 different people at least 6 times, I think it's supposed to be. What? Why? Why? Why would you do this? Why would you do this? It's completely inappropriate for him to be doing this at this time. I think Pat Rothfuss thinks that because he's smart, that means he's mature enough for this. But that would require that Rothfuss write him to be mature, and he's not. The first character that he has sex with is an immortal temptress fae lady. She's weird enough on her own and makes me uncomfortable enough on her own. I don't really like temptresses as a trope, but the fact that she saw a 16-year-old boy and decided he was the one that she was going to target, and then Rothfuss went through with it. This has been set up for a while, by the way. On the very back of the first book, it says, I have spent the night with Felurian and left with both my sanity and my life. This was always intended to happen. This was always going to be part of the story. I don't know what happened. I don't know if the main character got aged down and Patrick Rothfuss forgot. I don't know if he set this up knowing about it and didn't care. But there is always something wrong about a situation where a 15 to 16-year-old boy has to talk an immortal, ancient, fairy, beautiful temptress lady into letting him go so that they can stop having sex and he can go back to living his life. And then he goes out into the wider world, happy with having sexual experiences, and continues to seek them out. That is the exact kind of thing that, if you're going to dare to include it, should be character development. This is what you use to build a character. You don't just come up with one. You have to make them make sense and base their character on their experiences, and write experiences that impact their character. You can't just write something completely nonsensical and wrong like this. Go forward with it and then treat it as if nothing happened. Fuck you. Fuck him. And you know what? I think he is fucked, because there's no way he's gonna get a third book out. Like I said, nothing happened in this book. Patrick Rothfuss, in my personal belief, is pantsing these books. He says he has all 3 books written in a draft, but he doesn't know where he's going. He set nothing up with the 3rd book. He doesn't know how the main character is going to defeat the Chandrian and the immortal evil tree, and how the demons are going to start happening, which, by the way, there are demons which are never explained, and he doesn't know how, and he doesn't know what king Kvothe is going to kill, or who, or why, or what impact it will have on the world. He just wants to write a story about a poorly made character who the world warps around, and who repeatedly makes bad decisions, and has things happen to him that don't change his personality or impact his life story in any way. This is an icon of fantasy. I would suggest that if you like this book, you read it again and pay more attention. It's important to stay hydrated. This is cider. Hi, it's dark out. I needed a break. So, I also read some Discworld books this year, which was new for me. These are generally pretty well regarded within both fantasy and humor. They're kind of a crossover between the two. These are very fun, light fantasy humor books. I didn't really enjoy them all that much. The ones that I read were both Rincewind books, The Color of Magic, which is the very first one. And then I was told that this wasn't the best reading experience, so I tried again with Sorcery. And I wasn't really a fan of either one of them. I felt like they were trying a little too hard to be funny to explore any of the interesting concepts that they brought up, and vice versa, they were trying too hard to bring up interesting concepts to be genuinely hysterical. I don't mean to be demeaning. I'm glad that Pratchett is doing his own stuff, but the more time that he spends focusing on really serious plot elements, especially like Coin's arc in this book, I was actually genuinely pretty invested in. And so I found it mildly frustrating that the plot kept getting diverted to something that I wasn't as interested in. Maybe it's just that Rincewind is too incompetent to be genuinely enjoyable to follow, because I found that Rincewind was the problem with both of these books for me. He was not a fun or interesting character. He was funny, sure. He was not a very good wizard, but I was more invested in all of the other characters, and of course Rincewind got the most attention, as you might expect. So maybe, if you can tell me a different Terry Pratchett book that I can read with a more interesting main character, with a more likable main character, I could try that out. I know it's an unpopular opinion to say I didn't really like Discworld, but I don't mean to be insulting. They're great books. They're not bad books. They're just not for me. Let me know in the comments if there's any Discworld book that you think is better than these, and I'll be willing to try it out sometime next year, hopefully. Just this month, I read a book called The Rise and Fall of Dodo. I don't have it with me. It's by Neil Stephenson and Nicole Galland, and it's this very weird blend of like fantasy, sci-fi, speculative fiction. It's a super cool concept. It's about magic and witches and time travel. I really liked the scientific explanations that were going along with it. Granted, in a book like this, there's always going to be some science bullshit, but it was backed up by a surprising understanding of quantum physics that I don't normally expect out of books like this. It's an ambitious book. It covers a whole lot of topics. There was clearly a lot of research that went into it. And it also covers a lot of time. Pun not entirely intended. The title is authentic. It is about the rise and fall of a major governmental organization. And it is going to take you through that entire time period very thoroughly. It's a 700-page book, so it covers a lot, but speeds through certain aspects. I generally found it to be a fun new take on the epistolary format. It was written entirely using diary entries and letters and official communications. But instead of like a traditional epistolary novel where like a whole bunch of those are put together, it started off with just one narrative, and then as time went on, you got more and more different perspectives, and like you started with one person's diary, then you have like multiple people's diaries and letters that are being sent and internal memos and things like that, and those all tied together more tightly at the end in a very satisfying way. So I really like that. Most of the characters were great and very well established. Surfeit was pretty cool. Grian, I don't know if I'm getting her name right. She was interesting. I thought that the characters were well delineated. Mel, in particular, Melisande, the main character, could have used a bit more definition in my opinion. But granted, after she outlived her original purpose, she didn't really have all that much to do in the story, which is a little bit transparent, unfortunately. There is also one thing that I want to point out. At the beginning of the story, she's assigned to translate documents about magic. Never mind, I just realized that plot hole is explained. Excuse me. I plan to read book 2 of this series next year. It's called Master of the Rebels, and it's written solely by Nicole Galland, one of the co-authors of this book. I haven't read works from either of them before, so I'm excited to see which parts of The Rise and Fall of Dodo were more her style, and figure out what parts that I like that she was responsible for. Next up, Neil Gaiman's Sandman. This is not the first comic, it's the first issue of the Omnibus, which contains a whole bunch of different comics. I don't know the exact number, but I believe it's 8 or something to that effect. 20, excuse me. This book is not a book, which is unfortunate because I wanted to read a book, but if I had known it was not a book, maybe I would have been willing to try it in a different context. I don't mean to say that it's a graphic novel. No, this is not really a story. If you've seen the TV show Twin Peaks, this is the only thing that comes to mind. Twin Peaks isn't really a TV show, it's a piece of long-form experimental visual art. Once you start watching season 3, which is the season where they got the most creative control and decided to start doing new things, there's very little plot, and what little plot there is not really justified and doesn't make very much sense, but that's okay because you're meant to enjoy Twin Peaks in a kind of avant-garde way. It's not there to tell you a story. Similarly, this comic book is not really there to tell you a story. A lot of the issues are very disconnected. There's some issues about people that we've never seen before and never see again. There's this issue about how once cats ruled the world, and then humans had a dream, and so they stopped ruling the world, and now they want it back, which... It would be great if the DC universe would just go there, and then all the rest of the DC stories could be about cat people. I would watch that movie. I don't know, it's not... There's a little bit of a plot, but for the most part, it's not cohesive, which is okay. It is meant to be very dreamy, and if you like the dreamy aesthetic, and if this kind of thing is your dreamy aesthetic, let me find a good page. If this kind of thing is your dreamy aesthetic, could be fun. Could be something worth trying out. Try out, like, a few issues before you start buying the omnibus. This is, I think, supposed to be more like a collector's thing. Oops. Because I'm not really going to be reading after this. Sorry. And so we come to the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. If you're not familiar with this series, which outside of certain circles you probably aren't, it's a very well-respected series in fantasy that set a lot of trends in the genre and has inspired a number of the authors who are currently writing epic fantasy, which is, as you may have discovered, a genre that I'm quite interested in. So this year I decided to try out the Wheel of Time and see what it was about this series that inspired so many people to take inspiration from it. How original was it? How many new ideas did it come up with? How big and vibrant was the world? Well, at the beginning, basically none of that, because the first 2 books of this series, I'm just gonna say it, they're not very good. And I guess the most disappointing thing is I'm not even worried about Wheel of Time fans getting mad at me about this, because they agree. Wheel of Time fans think that most of the books in the Wheel of Time are not good. It is the most confusing fantasy fandom that I'm aware of. All that is to say, if these books aren't, like, stunning or beautifully original, they're still decent. There's still a lot to like in these books. And that's why I decided to keep reading to book 3, and also because I knew it had to get good at some point. And book 3 is excellent, and I liked it quite a bit. I want to start by talking about the characters, because Wheel of Time is famous for its characters. There are over 1,000 or over 3,000 named characters. I always get the numbers mixed up between Wheel of Time and Warrior Cats, as you may see later in this video. Anyway, the point is that there are quite a number of characters, and there are some characters, Elsa comes to mind, who just appear and then randomly return at unexpected intervals, despite having almost nothing to do with the plot. This is because of a world-building thing that I'm going to mention in a minute. However, one of the things that I want to mention about the characters is that as part of this design choice, we get a lot of different character perspectives in these books. We start mostly by focusing on Rand al'Thor, who's technically the main character, I guess. So, this book gets a whole lot of Rand perspective and Rand chapters. And that makes sense given that the story is mostly centered around him from the beginning, and later on when the characters split up into groups, he is the only character in his group who we would want narration from, for various plot reasons. But we also get some from Egwene and Perrin and Nynaeve in this book, I want to say. I read it early in the year, so I can't absolutely remember. A lot of the reason that the first 2 books were kind of boring is that a decent chunk of the narration came from Rand. Now, Rand has the potential to be an interesting character, and he is definitely being developed into an interesting character by book 3, but he is most interesting as a character who is viewed by the others around him. Everyone around him is more complex and more spirited, and frankly has more of a personality than he does. Rand is a very normal person. He's meant to be, and that kind of comes through in the story, which is too bad. Also, he's kind of dumb. Like, I don't mean that in a disparaging way, but there's this whole arc in book 2 where there's a super beautiful woman who is pretty obviously, like, evil or sketchy in some way. And you can basically tell that as soon as you read her. The situation where she comes into the story doesn't make any sense. And Rand, nonetheless, ends up trusting her, which has some bad consequences. Now, I like that this is not a storytelling device that Jordan uses a lot. It just happens in this book. In fact, the same character comes back a couple of times in this book, but the different characters that are mostly narrating this book notice what she's trying to do and foil her. I love when characters are able to solve their own problems, and I don't like the kind of suspense that the second book used, which is basically suspense that only works in an idiot plot. Continuing with talking about the characters in this, this book was, I think, the first Matt chapters that we got. I love it. I think he's great. I wasn't expecting him to be a fun character, but he really is. So, that was really exciting. We also got a lot of female perspectives in this book from Egwene and Nynaeve, and the new situation that they're in by this book makes them so interesting to follow and to watch how they've changed as people, but how their core personalities remain the same. I kind of love that. Basically, everything that I have to say about these books is that they didn't get thoroughly explored enough until the third book. There is very complicated world building in these books, but it's not quite like Tolkien complicated world building, where it's just like there's eons and eons of history and different species and dark lords and relations between them and the fall of cities. No, it's not really like that. It's basically a couple millennia ago, the world got completely destroyed, and so we barely remember anything that happened before that. So that means that all the world building has to be in the diversity of different societies and people that are in this world. There are definitely a lot of small touches going on in these books, but I think the real strength of the world building is when we get to see the bigger, more complicated things going on. I didn't like most of book 2. I thought it was kind of boring, but I liked Dace Daymar, The Game of Houses. That was fun. And in book 3, there was a little bit with the Illuminators, which I felt was... It's really hard to describe how that moment felt, but it was definitely very original and unexpected, and I love that kind of thing. Also, the Shan are really fun. The one problem that I have with the world building is that things aren't named very well. If something is a made-up fantasy word in these books, it will almost always be put in italics, which is a stylistic choice that you can do, but it also becomes very frustrating to read. And another thing that's frustrating is that a lot of the fantasy words just don't have clear pronunciations. Take one that appears all the time. Angreal, I believe. The glossary says that its pronunciation is Angreal, with the last syllable stressed. This is just a word for a magic object that lets you do weird stuff. The way that the word is spelled, it seems like it probably should be pronounced Angreal, but it's not. It's Angreal. And so it kind of breaks the flow of the text whenever you read it, because it doesn't have a stress pattern that is familiar. Now, I suppose you can do that sort of thing to incorporate some kind of interesting linguistic diversity, but you actually have to have a reason for it, and I don't really see why this book does it. The other problem this book has is that it uses cute little nods to things that it really shouldn't know about. I think, I'm not like 100% sure, but it seems to me from the way that this series is written that this is meant to be a representation of our world either like way, way in the future or way, way in the past. After, or after or before a couple apocalypses, so humanity kind of forgot what's going on. And that's why there's nods to things that happened in our world. For instance, there's this really heavy focus on King Arthur, and a cheeky little thing in the third book where the destined prophecy guy has to pull a sword out of the stone, except in this case, it's just a fortress, which is called the Stone. So, hey, it's not exactly what it is, but it's still obviously a King Arthur reference. There's also King Arthur in these books. He's called Arthur Hawkwing, but he's obviously King Arthur. In fact, I think his dad was even called Arthur Pendrag, which is meant to be Pendragon, obviously. I don't know that much about King Arthur, so I really can't say why this is in here or what it means. Also perplexingly annoying is this creative choice that Robert Jordan made with the Trollocs. Trollocs are kind of like the orcs of this world, but they're like animal people. They're evil and the Dark Lord made them or something. According to the glossary, they are divided into tribe-like bands, and it then lists a couple of these tribe-like bands, and for some reason, all of them are extremely distorted and difficult to pronounce warpings of names of random mythical creatures with no relation to each other. So I'll try and pronounce some of them. Offright is Ifrit. Bansheen is Banshees. Davol and Daimon are meant to be devil and demon. There's Gargoyle, which is gargoyle. Goblin, which is literally actually just goblin, but with 2 extra H's and an apostrophe. Golem, which is the same thing, it's golem with 2 extra H's and an apostrophe. Gremlin, which is gremlin. Kobold, which is kobold. And gnomon, which I think is meant to be gnomes. And there's also 2 others that I wasn't able to figure out what they were, but like, these never actually appear in the book. The bands of Trollocs and the names of the bands of Trollocs are only listed in the first book, and they don't appear there. They don't appear in the other 2 books either. I was watching because I knew how weird they were. So I don't know why Jordan chose to include them, and I don't know why he chose to include this cheeky little nod to regular mythical creatures. Like, the Trollocs are already unspecified animal people in a whole different bunch of forms, and he barely describes them either. Just says that they have beaks and hooves and horns and various animal parts, but human. They're basically just humanoids with various animal parts that are non-specific and different between the different kinds of Trollocs. Something else I forgot to mention, I find it kind of weird how Robert Jordan handles his magic users in this world. Part of the world building is because of something that the bad guy did a long time ago. All of the magic users in the world are female. And in the country where they rule, which is, let me remind myself, in the city of Tar-Valon, where the Aes Sedai, the female magic users, rule, they are well respected and trusted. But outside of there, despite one of their oaths meaning that they can only speak the truth, they are generally regarded as totally evil, never trust them, and they are always manipulating you. This seems to be like a folk thing, but there's almost no establishment of it, and it mostly serves as like a roadblock in the plot for the male characters to not trust the people who are trying to help them. It's mildly frustrating, and it feels like this book is taking a bit of a cue from Dune, without actually doing the same thing as Dune, which is good. I don't want it to. Okay, let's try out some literary fiction. By which I mean, I learned this year that anything can be literature. So let's try out my politely named miscellaneous category. Bunny by Mona Awad. Like the Animal. This is a book not about bunnies. For the most part, there are some bunnies in it. It's about a young woman who is in a graduate writing program at a prestigious university and is experiencing tensions within her writing workshop between the very weird other girls who are there. I won't give too much of it away. I will say, in vibe, I think it's a little bit like Heathers. I'm speculating. I haven't seen Heathers, but I bet you that if you liked Heathers, you would probably like this book. Now, normally, the plot elements and the story structure of this book would not really be up my alley. It has a very dark fantasy feel, and the magic system is extremely soft, which I know I've been talking about that this entire video, but what a soft magic system means is that it doesn't have that many discernible rules, and you can't fully explain how it works. So stuff just kind of happens, and it's not explained how, or what causes it, or how you can get these things to happen. Soft magic really works in this book. I'm not a fan of it normally, but I think in this context, it is used in the best possible way. This, like I mentioned, is kind of a dark fairy tale, and the way that the magic distorts reality, and then the way that the characters have to work around that and figure out ways to experience this new reality that they've created and potentially convince themselves to destroy it, is super interesting. I found it really fun and sinister in that kind of a way. I read this in basically one sitting. It was very gripping. One thing I did struggle with is I didn't really have a character to attach to. The main character, Samantha, is, I'll be generous, she's not that likable of a person. There are not very many characters in this story, which keeps it small and simple, but also it's not super helpful for trying to find somebody that you can follow and check in with to make sure they're alright. This is always something I struggle with. I always want at least one character who I can relate to or care about over the course of a story. But I didn't really get that with this book, which is unfortunate because it was a really good book. If you know about modern retellings of Greek mythology, you know about Madeline Miller. Her novels have been very well reviewed in the last several years, ever since Song of Achilles came out, and Circe followed it recently, I believe in 2018. This is older than I thought. Both Circe and the Song of Achilles are dreamy and emotional and deeply complex retellings of Greek mythology that focus on the tragic interpersonal stories in the narrative, instead of like the battles and action that a lot of other retellings cover. Miller really understands Greek mythology in a way that I don't necessarily see too many other authors do, and this is because she has a master's degree in classics, so this is exactly her field, and instead of going further into study, she decided to write novels about it and make it more accessible to the general population, which is great. In my personal opinion, I can't help comparing the stories. I thought Song of Achilles was better. It did have a very weird ending, like the last 20 pages were an interesting creative choice. Nonetheless, it hit harder for me than Circe, which felt a little bit directionless. That is the point. Circe feels directionless for a lot of this book, so I can understand that she was trying to go for that, but it's not necessarily the best thing for a compelling narrative or structure. These books also have really nice prose. They're smooth to read. It really evokes the feeling of Greece, even though it's not the same as if you were reading an epic poem like the Iliad or the Odyssey. It's a bit different than that sort of thing. I also read The Color Purple this year for my first time. The Color Purple by Alice Walker, a well-known historical novel about two black women sisters living in the South. I would really recommend this book. It's super emotional, super interesting, and honestly kind of devastating. I love the characters. They all felt like complex, intricate people. The voice was really interesting. It took me some time to get used to because I'm not familiar with that kind of dialect. And the story was super authentic and deep. I really enjoyed that book. I would highly recommend it. I'm sorry I can't say too much more. I read it in February, so I don't remember it all that well. Oh my god, On the Road. The exact opposite experience. On the Road by Jack Kerouac, if you're not familiar with it, which I wasn't before reading the book, is a classic novel of America about some white guys who are driving around the country for no reason. It is about 300 pages long. For reference, I read 300 pages in one sitting all the time and have done it with several of the books on this list. It takes me about 2 hours. This book took me a month to read. It was an extended experience. It was an awful experience. And I am never going to read anything by this author again. I will not touch it with a 10-foot pole. The characters were terrible. I don't mean to say that they weren't established and developed. Like, I think there was definitely some development going on and I got hints of their personality, but I didn't care because they were all terrible, shallow, selfish, reductive, bigoted people. And it was really frustrating to watch this story about supposedly youthful freedom, and there's a bit of hedonism thrown in there, which is, I guess, characteristic of the time period. It was very frustrating to watch this happen. The plot was absolutely meaningless. Like, there was no plot. It's just about guys driving around America. Sometimes they pick up guys they know. Sometimes they stay in places and sleep with girls. Sometimes they find out something new and think that suddenly they understand the world, but they never do because they never understand empathy. I experienced this horrifying realization about 120 pages into the book when I got to part 2. At the end of part 1, the main character, Sal, has already gone on this journey all across America and through, like, from New York to Denver and LA for a little while, and then I think he's back in Denver or something. I can't remember all the journeys. But anyway, you get to the end of part 1, and all that was backstory for the actual story, which is gonna start now, and is just basically the same thing, except he goes to different places with different people. I understand that this is supposed to be a book that is entirely set during traveling, but you would think you would at least do something with interesting characters during that time to make the travels mean something. And maybe this is just me. And maybe this is just Jack Kerouac. I've noticed this problem that some male writers have, and I'm saying writers broadly, not just like people who write books, and definitely not people in the 50s. It's still a problem today. Some male writers, white male writers, will like make a white male character and then think, oh, I don't need to make him relatable at all. He's already relatable. I don't know if it's something about privilege or like lack of insight, but you need to make a character have a nice personality in order for people to care about them. You can't just make them look like you and then expect everyone to have the same reaction to them that you will. I only get invested in characters when I like them or I think they're interesting. And none of the characters in this book are either of those things. I don't think this book is for me, and I feel pretty confident saying it's not for anyone else either. I guess you do you if you enjoy it, but oh my god, I was so bored the entire time. It was such a waste of my time. It took all of October. You know, it was fun though. Okay, I lied. It wasn't really that fun, but it was definitely interesting and weird and funky. This book did also take me a month, but it was a month that I enjoyed more. February was cool. This book is weird. Paradise Lost by John Milton, the original epic poem about Christianity, and one of the few epic poems about Christianity. I'm not actually aware of any others. This is the Norton Critical Edition edited by Gordon Teskey, if you want to read the same one I did. This is one of those foundational works that has had such an impact on the history of literature that it cannot be understated. This is the book that reimagined Satan as edgy. And for that, I will give it all the credit. Granted, I don't think this book entirely accomplished what it was trying to accomplish, because the point of it is that Satan is still supposed to be bad. He's the kind of character who purposefully misinterprets things into his favor and distorts reality in a way that supports his opinion. Like Mapleshade, actually. Satan's like Mapleshade. I'll talk about that later. There were also a lot of weird moments in this book that I found really funny. This is just my juvenile humor talking. There's this whole part where Milton feels the need to go through and explain that Eve and Adam did not need to relieve themselves because they were perfect humans, and that actually they just passed so much gas, and then God took care of it. Like, it's just these kinds of things that are so over-explained in this book that make it fun. There's also a part where Eve has this horrifying dream where she's about to take the apple from the serpent, and then she blacks out and doesn't take the apple, and then she's like flying or something. I don't remember it totally, this was February. But anyway, Adam's response to that is to spend 2 pages mansplaining to her about personifications of how dreams work, and that she can't control it, which obviously she knew already. And then he tells her, it's fine, you'll just be prettier if you smile. It felt very authentic, and I like the human touch that's in here. I will say, the reason that I read this book, and the reason that you might want to read this book, is because I have read his Dark Materials, which is the children's literature series about killing God. It's great. I would highly recommend those books, and if you have already read those books and liked them, this was the inspiration for it. So it's really fun for me now. I'm actually watching the 3rd season of the TV show right now, going through and being like, that's a parallel. He's supposed to be Satan. She's the snake. This is how this is going to turn out. This is all super meaningful in the context of Paradise Lost. It's also very cool to see how central this narrative is to fiction, and that's just a small part of it. Now's when we start sitting down and talking about the meaning of literature. Literature is a very vague genre. In my personal experience, it seems to be any story that either the writer or the agent or the publishing house finds to be emotionally meaningful, which is very vague. One of these books is called Solenoid. It is a 600-page Romanian surrealist body horror novel, which is not advertised as such, and is instead considered to be a deep expression of literature. The praise on the back was so absurdly high that I can't even quantify how confused I was when I started getting into this book and figuring out that it wasn't what you would normally consider literature. But I believe that any book that takes itself seriously enough and can convince enough other people that it should be deep and serious turns out to be literature, I guess. There's really no definition. Let's stop ragging on genre fiction if this is what we're getting for literature. I'm not saying it's bad that this isn't really literature. Just let's expand our horizons. Okay, so about the book. The author is Mircea Cartarescu, I believe. I'm sorry if I'm getting that wrong. I hope I pronounced it correctly. It is a body horror / magical realism novel that is about this unnamed narrator going through life, experiencing weird events, and it's mostly about him cataloging all the weird events that happened to him and trying to find a meaning in them. And eventually, like, at the end, there's a couple different threads that tie together, and he has to, like, kind of prove his value as a human in order to keep living or something. I don't totally get, like, all the symbolism that's going on there. I think it's a little overloaded, but it was reasonably meaningful, I guess. One thing I will say, I don't know if this is the translator's or the author's problem, but if you're going to overuse words within a novel, you know, sometimes that's something that happens. One time when I was writing a draft, I used the word knife way too many times for things that were not knives. Also, unwavering for some reason was a word that I keep coming back to. You see people getting criticized for using the same word a couple times in their books. That's fine. But if you're gonna use words multiple times, can they not be... Larvae was one of them. I can't remember the other two, but they were also really bothersome. Also, this one word, the absolute felony of a word, invaginate. It's gross. Please don't. Appears twice in this book. So, something to notice. If you want to read this book, there's two things you need. A great vocabulary, because there is a lot of very obscure words used, and you need to have the patience for a lot of nonsense. There is a lot of nonsense in this book. There's a time when the sky is made of jelly. He and this other woman have gravity sex like a whole bunch of times. He turns into a mite at one point, like a skin mite, and becomes Mite Jesus on some other guy's hand. It's a very weird book. But hey, it's better than Haruki Murakami. The Stolen Book of Evelyn Aubrey is not the book on this list that was stolen. That comes later. This is an interesting book. It's not necessarily bad, but it's one of those situations where it wasn't what I was expecting. The title gives away the twist. It spends a lot of time building up that Evelyn's book was stolen. Which is too bad, you know, because you could have named it something else. Every other twist in this book is also kind of obvious. Like, it's not all that twisty, it's kind of just, you read it and stuff happens, and you have to care about the characters. which is fine. I mean, they're not bad people. I got a little bit attached to them, which is nice. I'll be honest, the story isn't all that strong, but hey, it's a light read, and if you need some way to spend an afternoon, this should do it. It's cozy. This is another book that's also like this, The Things We Cannot Say by Kelly Rimmer. I was lent this book by one of the women that I sing with, and after I finished reading it, I tried to give it back, and she didn't want it back, so now I'm stuck with it. It's not bad. It's not bad. If you like World War II drama, this is probably right up your alley. It's a World War II drama. I don't know. I guess when I saw the title, which is very reminiscent of another title, I was expecting it to be more like All the Light We Cannot See, but it wasn't. It wasn't. I guess it's an interesting portrayal of a mom whose son is non-verbally autistic. It seems like a lot of research went into that, so that's great. Thanks, Kelly Rimmer, for putting effort into good representation. Yeah, I don't really have that much to say about this book. Sorry. I'll be honest, I'm not a romance fan. But when I do read romance, I tend to gravitate towards diverse romance. In this case, gay romance. Because usually, gay romance has a reason to be there. And straight romance is just because two people looked at each other and thought, hey, they're hot, and then they banged. Anyway, this is a very sweet book about these two men. One of them is dead, and as they get to know each other more, one of them, Wallace, gets a whole lot of character development. He's like typical heartless accountant guy at the beginning of the book, but he's developed really well and starts to become more caring and a better person, which is really sweet to watch. The world building is also really cool, and you don't normally see that kind of thing in the context of a book like this, but I really enjoyed the way that being a ghost was set up and the entire bureaucracy around being a ghost. And at one point the manager shows up, and the manager is a very mysterious character, and I really enjoyed their scene. So that was very cool. This book has a more insular focus than The House on the Cerulean Sea, which I believe was more popular. That was the T.J. Klune book that I read last year and really enjoyed, and that's why I got this book. Instead of focusing on, like, I want to say 8 or 9 characters like that other book did, this only has about 4. So it's a much tighter focus, but that means that each member of the cast is much clearer, has much clearer development, and feels like more of a distinct person, which is great. While there are 4 main characters, there are also a couple other people in here that are really fun to see. Desdemona Triplethorn is a personal favorite. Her scenes were great. I actually laughed really hard while reading this book, so huge bonus on that. Also, the names are great. Desdemona Triplethorn should give you a cue. Highly recommend this book. I enjoyed it a lot. The Violin Conspiracy by Brendan Slocum is beautiful, meaningful, well-researched false advertising. In contrast to the usual, regular, bad false advertising. I bought this in an airport bookstore, which means I knew nothing about it, and it was the only thing that looked good. This book is the sweet and very moving story of a young black violinist's experience with music and marginalization. It follows him over the course of basically his entire life and his experiences, and how his identity impacts the way he makes music and vice versa. And I want to say this author really understands what it feels like to make music. All the descriptions of when Ray is playing are really authentic, and I really felt it. So I appreciate that quite a bit. He also, this is kind of spoilers, but like, if you're going into the book, I hope that this is not the twist that you're watching for. At the end of the book, he gets second place in a violin competition, and the way that he feels after getting second place was very familiar to me, somebody who has gotten second place in a music competition. So, I don't know, maybe the author has gotten second place in a music competition, and so that's how he knows how it feels. But he knows how it feels, and that's really cool. This book was written with a lot of love and a lot of attention. Now the problem is there's no conspiracy. There's no conspiracy whatsoever in this book. I guess systemic racism is a conspiracy, but I don't know what that has to do with the violin. Yeah, it's not a thriller, but it's really sweet. Enjoy! Last on my literature list is a short book called Your Guide to Getting Murdered in a Quaint English Village, which Your Guide to Not Getting Murdered in a Quaint English Village, which, as you might imagine from the title, is a coffee table book. I don't know, I thought it looked cute, and so my friend lent it to me, and I read it, and I gotta say, it's above average for a coffee table book. So if you're looking for a coffee table book, let's talk about some murder mysteries. The Appeal was a mystery book that I read actually twice this year. It's a book by Janice Hallett, and it's not really focused on the detective aspect of the story so much as the mystery itself, which isn't really something I see a lot in a mystery, which is refreshing. I like this book. I thought it was great. It's an epistolary book, which if you're not familiar with that concept, it's, for example, Dracula, where it's written entirely in documents pertaining to the story. So that book is made up of letters and journals and news articles and things like that. The Appeal is kind of a refined version of that, or almost the entire thing is composed of emails between a relatively small group of people who are involved in a local performance theater group. Because of that, I feel like this book kind of distills the mystery to its absolutely essential components, which is establishing the sharpest possible characterization for almost all of the people involved, and quite literally showing you several different perspectives on various events that happen within the book. That's really clever. I liked putting together clues and events after the fact, trying to figure out from the different emails and recaps and apologies what exactly happened at various community events that had been hosted off-screen. I also like the framing story. Like I said, the detectives don't really come up very much in this, and that's because in this story, a lawyer from a law firm has access to all these emails and is going to go prosecute in court with the story that he believes he figured out. But in order to make sure that he's right, he takes out some of the key information and then sends it to his interns to see if they can figure it out too. That's a really clever idea, and it provides an actual reasonable reason why we're missing some information here. We don't get any emails that were written from the victim. Which, I'll be honest, it took me a while to notice that, but on my second read-through it was very apparent. I will add that the climax of the story and the reveal of the mystery did wilt a bit on the first read, but I feel like that was my fault, which is always a good sign in a book. I feel like I wasn't paying enough attention, and so when I knew everything beforehand and I went through and read the book again, it held up, and the foreshadowing was just as strong as the twist. This is one of the key elements of a good mystery and a rereadable book in general. This book has a direct sequel, which is a novella called The Christmas Appeal, and Janice Hallett has written a couple other books, and I'm going to look into them next year because I like this one, so I'm sure I'll enjoy the others just as much. So I read this one book this year called The Big Over Easy by Jasper Fforde, which it's a bit difficult to put this book into a genre since it's a mix of so many different things. It's mystery strongly, that's like the structure of the plot, but it could also be classified as metafiction and fantasy. Metafiction isn't really a genre so much as it is a literary device, and I'll try to explain it to the best of my ability if you're not familiar with it. Metafiction is any kind of storytelling device which refers to the fact that this is a story. For an example of the metafiction in The Big Over Easy, this is a world where some people are just nursery rhymes, and they don't seem to know their nursery rhymes, and the characters kind of comment on this. Almost every character in the book is a character from a nursery rhyme, and their characterization is inspired and sometimes made fun of because of that. The point is, while the characters don't seem to know that they are characters, they know that the other characters are characters, and they make references to it regularly. Now, normally this kind of metafiction is pretty flawed because it just punches enormous holes in the plot and logic of the story, But I actually like it in this book, because this book is willing to take itself seriously. Its strength is its confidence. It plays everything straight, and it is honest about the fact that this world is weird and has a lot of strange things going on. The jokes are not at the expense of how weird this story is, which is a device that metafiction uses sometimes, which I don't really like. They're mostly at the expense of how the author is putting the story together. I like it when the characters are questioning the structure of their world, and I like it when they're willing to make jokes about that. Because as long as it's not a joke explicitly at the expense of the world building, which happens a lot in metafiction, and which I'll talk about later in this video, feels solid, feels great. This book is also really funny, as you might expect with this kind of premise. I haven't actually told you what the premise of the book is yet. So it's called The Big Over Easy, and that is a little nod to the fact that this is a murder mystery, and the murder victim is Humpty Dumpty, who fell off a wall and broke into pieces, and we're not really sure why or who caused it. And so the entirety of the book is Jack Spratt, who's the investigator on this case, who's a character from a totally different nursery rhyme, trying to figure out who killed Humpty Dumpty and why they'd want to. It feels a little more like a police procedural than the types of mysteries that I normally like to read, but it was enjoyable nonetheless because it was set in this weird and crazy world that I wanted to explore. Also, the mystery is surprisingly good. It's a super intriguing book in a lot of places. It makes you curious about what all the different characters are up to and what they want to do, and I liked how the mystery slowly plotted together. The mystery itself used metafiction a bit as a device, but I think it's still possible that you could figure it out even without using that, which is a very solid principle for mysteries. And I like the conclusion that it came to. It felt really clever. It was one of those things where I was like, why didn't I think of this before? But of course, made perfect sense. And isn't that kind of the key of mysteries? One thing I will say about this book is it's absolutely full of literary references, and I'm pretty well read. Like, I was able to catch most of the obscure ones in books like Solenoid, but here, I honestly missed some of them, and I wasn't sure of all of them. And so if you're, like, really well read and you want to give this book a crack, you might get even more enjoyment out of it than I did. There are sequels, and there are other books set in kind of similar weird metafiction-y worlds. I'm gonna read the fourth bear, and then after that I might read the one about the colors or the one about the rabbits, or Thursday next. I'm keeping an eye on all of them because I just like Jasper Fforde and his writing style, so maybe I'll read a whole bunch more of him next year. We'll see. This isn't the book whose title gives away the plot. No, that's The Stolen Book of Evelyn Aubrey, and I already talked about that in this video. This is the book that is stolen, that I had foreshadowed since then. Okay, let me get a start. Remember how sometimes I say that it takes me a few days to realize something about a book I'm reading, or to, like, analyze it in kind of a deeper way? Yeah, well, that happened for this one. Right after I read it, I had a pretty solidified idea of my opinion on it. It was a pretty good thriller. I felt it was a stronger thriller than it was a mystery, but, you know, that's okay. The characters were good, they were very well established, and I was engaged and involved with them, and curious about how their development would progress over the course of the story. I liked the setup, and I liked how the different characters were suddenly forced back into something they tried so hard to forget. That's a really cool plot device, and I like that it was being used here. The climax was fine, nothing particularly spectacular about it, but the story itself was interesting, and I was engaged by the rest of the drama, but not necessarily the mystery. Story elements like the suicide note that one of the characters wrote and that ended up having to be interpreted in a different way for the mystery to be solved were surprisingly strong. And then I realized a few days later that Ruth Ware came up with almost none of this. Most of this book is like this weird Mad Libs remix version of Agatha Christie's Five Little Pigs, which is a book that I quite like. In Five Little Pigs, there's a couple of elements that ended up carrying over into this book. One of them is the suicide note that gets interpreted in a different way to solve the mystery. Granted, the context is different, but it's still basically the same thing. One of them is the fact that the characters, many years later, are being asked to recount a mystery that happened to them when they were younger. In fact, the gap of time is, I want to say, about somewhere between 15 and 20 years in both books, which is very striking to me. One of them is the fact that there's a subplot about a character who doesn't want to get sent to boarding school, but who overhears a conversation about it, and that changes the trajectory of the plot. One of them is the step-sibling, who has some kind of long-term conflict with their family. And yet another one is, like, literally how the murder victim gets poisoned. In Five Little Pigs, the murderer puts hemlock in Ammius Crail, the artist's, beer. In this book, the murderer puts morphine in Ambrose, the artist's, wine. In fact, both artists, who are both the murder victims, also have a whole arc about being reputed to do something inappropriate, but actually it's fine, and it's not inappropriate, and that's part of the twist. Like, what? Why would you do this? I don't understand this. Like, is Ruth Ware just physically incapable of coming up with her own plot elements? In fact, I think this book would have been more interesting if she hadn't just decided to use the plot elements from Five Little Pigs in a different order. It doesn't have the same solution to the mystery. It doesn't even, like, have the same context in which some of the situations occur. But for some reason, all the situations themselves, when boiled down to the most simplistic versions of themselves, are exactly the same. I can't possibly understand why you would do this with a book, especially a mystery, which is meant to be carefully plotted out in a way such that all the situations interact with each other sensically. What? Okay. As you might gather from the general tone of this book review, sometimes I watch Crimson Rogue videos on YouTube, and Ruth Ware was an author recommended to me by Crimson Rogue. And nothing against him, but I guess I can't trust YouTube recommendations because this is not an original book. And I want to read an original book. And the most infuriating part of all of this is that nobody is talking about it. Like, Ruth Ware has a whole lot of fans. This was a New York Times best-selling book, and it's not even an American book. It came out in England. This book is actually so confident about itself, there's not even a summary on the back. This white part is the list of accolades that this book received. A lot of people like it. A lot of people read it. I think this author has a lot of fans. So why are none of them talking about this very basic thing that she did wrong in this book? You would think that when you look this up online, you would be able to find some fans complaining about this somewhere. But no. The only person on the internet who is talking about this weird similarity is fucking Ruth Ware. What? Why would you admit this? She admits this on her page where she's advertising for this book. This is inspired by Five Little Pigs and Sleeping Murder, which, by the way, has nothing to do with Sleeping Murder, but whatever. I don't understand why she would write a book like this that is very, very clearly takes almost every plot element from Five Little Pigs. Tell her fans that on a public website, and then none of them would notice, and this book would go on to get a paragraph of accolades. I'm not even really that angry, given that Five Little Pigs is probably almost public domain now. I'm just baffled and confused as to why she would do this, and then admit it. What? Anthony Horowitz, are you okay? Do you need help? I'm not even being sardonic. I read this book and I'm genuinely concerned about your well-being and your happiness in the field that you have chosen. Okay, I'll get to that, but first off, let me tell you about this book. This is Magpie Murders, not The Magpie Murders, which is actually a plot point, so I'm sorry if I call it by the wrong name in this review. It's just got a weird title. The book is by Anthony Horowitz, who is a semi-well-established mystery author. He's written a couple of different novels before. If you look at the beginning of this book, it says he's written something called Trigger Mortis, which I'm not familiar with. I know he wrote 2 books, which were Sherlock Holmes fanfiction. I know he wrote Alex Rider, which I've never engaged with, so I don't know anything about that. and he was a screenwriter at some point, so maybe he has some fans who watched his TV shows or something. This was a New York Times best-selling book, so ostensibly it made at least a bit of a splash, and he feels well-established in his field. That will come up later. Okay, the first complaint that I have about this book is totally irrelevant to all of that. I kind of hate the structure. The way that this book is put together. The plot is that a manuscript is sent to an editor of a book by a famous mystery author whose name is Alan Conway. Now, Conway's manuscript is incomplete, and the editor doesn't realize this until she gets to the end of it. So what we have is a very brief section that's narrated by the editor, then almost the entirety of Conway's manuscript, then a whole long segment where the editor tries to solve the mystery of Conway's death, and then at the end we get the last few pages of Conway's manuscript that reveal the mystery of the story in the manuscript, which is not very good, but I'll get to that. The frustrating part of this is that in order to make this as realistic as possible, we get page numbers that reflect this. So we have pages 1 through 4, then we have pages 1 through 213, then we have pages 5 through 232, then we have pages 214 through 241, then we have pages 233 through 236. This is nonsense. It's a creative choice that I really don't see the point of because I don't feel immersed anyway. Because page numbers don't really impact my sense of immersion, and it makes it extremely hard to pull any quote out of the book. You can't even use first and second page 200 because they're in different orders sometimes. So it's very confusing, and I think it's a poor choice. Don't do this if you're writing a book. This book is split into 2 sections. The internal mystery is the one in Conway's manuscript, and the external mystery is the one that the editor is trying to solve about Conway's death. The internal mystery it's okay. It's nothing special. It's meant to be Agatha Christie imitation. This book is advertised as having Agatha Christie roots. I believe at one point Washington Post even said that this was Agatha Christie ventriloquism, which is quite the descriptor. I don't think that because it completely misses the point of what Christie did with her mysteries. Christie would always use some kind of interesting hook to keep readers engaged and to keep all of her mysteries unique and intriguing. For example, maybe all of the characters have something to hide, but it doesn't have to do with the murder. Maybe it's presented to you as a thriller, but actually it's a murder mystery. Maybe the murderer is trying to take advantage of some weird aspect of UK law in order to keep themselves safe, even if they do get implicated. Maybe the murderer is a character who normally would trust in this kind of a story. There are all kinds of things that Agatha Christie does to keep each one of her stories fresh. And this book doesn't have any of them. It feels like the most lifeless, bland, generic Agatha Christie mystery, and it's missing the spice that she actually would put into her stories, and so I don't understand why Alan Conway, the author, is supposed to be so popular in world, because it's not a manuscript that interests me very much, even though I read a lot of mystery. That's a bad sign. As for the external mystery, which is the editor, Susan Ryland, trying to figure out what happened to Conway, and eventually, of course, she does figure out who murdered him and why. It's actually really great. I like the way it's put together, and I like the conclusion that she eventually comes to, and I like the twists. It's good, or at least, it could be good. It could be good if it dared to take itself seriously. But this book suffers from a near-fatal case of something that analysts tend to call lampshading. Now, to explain it in the most simple way that I can, lampshading is a very weak type of metafiction in which the author will use characters or elements within the story in order to make fun of their own story. They're not making fun of the characters or elements or the world. They are using those elements to look at you, the reader, and tell you, hey, this is unrealistic and it's not very good. Haha, isn't that funny? And no, it's almost never funny, because it's just pointing out to you how bad this story is and asking, why are you reading this bad story? This is actually more common among amateur writers, which is why it's weird that I'm seeing Anthony Horowitz use it, because some amateur writers who don't have the confidence to take their work seriously will try and deprecate it before anyone else can, and use lampshading to do that. I've done this myself in the first fantasy series that I tried to write. I lampshaded the hell out of the ending because I was legitimately embarrassed about how I put it together and the twist didn't make sense. I haven't revisited that story since, and I have since learned to not do this because it has a bad impact on the story. To give you an example of the lampshading in this book, there's a part later on in which Susan, the detective of the external mystery, is running around a train station going somewhere and runs into a character that the murderer had been trying to take precautions that Susan would not meet. And they share some information which helps Susan figure out the rest of the mystery. Now, at the beginning of this chapter, when Susan is explaining this, she has something very distinct that she says about this. I don't like coincidences in novels, and particularly not in murder mysteries, which work because of logic and calculation. The detective really should be able to reach his conclusion without having Providence on his side. But that's just the editor and me speaking, and unfortunately this is what happened. And then she has the coincidence where she runs into the other character. Now, I can see what Anthony Horowitz thought he was doing with this, which is trying to establish Susan's character and at the same time point out something interesting about his story and give an introduction to this chapter. But it doesn't come across this way. It comes across as the editor character in the story that I'm writing does not like that story and thinks it should be changed. This story is not good and it should be changed. Now I get that's not what he was trying to do, but that's just how it comes across. And this is only one example of many, many examples. Since I don't think you should read this book, I'll just tell you a lot of the twist rests on the fact that Alan Conway, the mystery writer, doesn't like writing mysteries, and he makes fun of his own mysteries within them in a lot of ways. Alan Conway lampshades, and that's a bad thing. But Anthony Horowitz doesn't realize that in the external mystery, the one that Alan Conway isn't writing, he is also lampshading. So of course, I see the parallel that is being subconsciously drawn between him and Conway, the writer who does not like writing mysteries, and of course I have to ask, do you like your job, buddy? Like, I get that you have a lot of experience writing mysteries, and I get that you're British and mystery is a core genre in England, but like, maybe you should try writing something else if you're this unhappy. That's how this comes across. Maybe I'm misreading it. I don't know. But this is what Horowitz is telling me, and this is the only conclusion that I can come to. And in that case, I'm sorry for him. And I hope that he can find a situation where he can write some other type of fan fiction, and maybe the people who enjoyed his Sherlock Holmes fan fiction can follow him there. I'm not saying that in a deprecating way. Fan fiction is not always bad. In many cases it's great, and in many cases, if you can get it published, that means it's even better. The Maid is, by almost every metric, one of the worst books that I read this year. And I find it extremely disappointing that not only was this book well reviewed by people who just must not have actually read it, it is actually getting a sequel, which I will not read, even though I am vicariously angry about it. So remember how I mentioned with The Big Over Easy that that book's strength was in its confidence and its willingness to play itself straight? This book's weakness is in its confidence, and the confidence of the author that she knows how to write a mystery despite never having written one before, that she knows how to represent a neurodivergent character despite never having represented a neurodivergent character before, and apparently the confidence of a whole bunch of deluded reviewers that this book is good despite it not being good. Nita Prose, I'm gonna check up on this to make sure that I'm right about this, because it seems like the most absolutely insane thing to me. She is apparently an editor, and this is her debut novel, so you would think that she would know how to write a good story, at the very least, but she doesn't. She says that a long time ago she taught teens with special needs, but she doesn't say, like, what context that was in, or how deep her experience was with this, so we don't get any sense that she actually knows what she's doing or has expertise. Like, just because you've met someone who's neurodivergent doesn't really qualify you to explain how neurodivergent people work, especially not in such a terrible and insensitive way. Okay, so my actual problems with this book I haven't even gotten to yet. The mystery of this book is almost completely reliant on the character and the fact that you will think that the character is lovable. And the character in this book is almost completely based on outdated stereotypes about neurodivergent people. Molly the maid, who is the main character of this book, has some kind of unspecified neurodivergence. Like, it's not clear what specifically she would be diagnosed with, or if she would be considered autistic maybe, or OCD. She just kind of feels like she has random traits that are ripped from a whole bunch of different types of neurodivergence. Now, I don't mean to say that in a book where you're representing a neurodivergent character, you have to bring up their exact diagnosis or their experience with that. Not everyone has actually been diagnosed, and it seems like Molly has been literally isolated long enough that she wouldn't have been. That's fine. But you, the author, at least have to know that so that you can do your research and represent them accurately. And that doesn't happen in the slightest in this book, because Molly is actually barely a character. She's mostly a plot device. What Nita Prose likes about Molly that she can use to her advantage is this. Molly is nice and trusting in almost any situation. She doesn't really put facts together, but she does notice almost everything that she sees and has a good memory. She is presented in a lot of context as just kind of being dumb, which is obviously a very bad way to represent somebody who's literally just neurodivergent. For example, I'll give you one example. There is a scene where Molly is going into a hotel room where she thinks her friend is staying, and she sees these two very tall, buff guys who have these duffel bags, and there's like white powder on the table and stuff. And the guys look at her and talk to her kind of aggressively. Now, Molly's response to this is, first, she's slightly scared of the guys, in a pretty standard kind of way. But then she stops, she thinks, well, Grandma told me to be nice to everyone, and then she is nice to them and never doubts them again. We actually get to see this in her voice, and that's why it doesn't make sense. Because, in fact, Molly is purposefully going against her instincts here. I barely even find myself able to explain why this doesn't make sense, because it's so obvious. This isn't an experience that a person would have. Like, if she's scared of them, then why is she purposefully and actively repressing that? If she wants to be nice to them, because that's just the kind of person she is, then why did she feel scared in the first place? And if she was scared of them in the first place, then why the hell, when she was going through and cleaning the hotel room that they were in, did she think that the white powder all over the table was powdered sugar? The way this book is designed, Molly sees almost every clue you could possibly need in order to put the mystery together. But this is fine, because the bad guys know that Molly is stupid. I'm using that because that's the way that the story is written. And they use that to manipulate her, rob her, and actually get her in on their nefarious deeds. Now, meanwhile, the story itself makes so little actual sense that there is no way that anyone could figure it out, regardless of their level of intelligence, unless they knew what was going on. A lot of the plot of this book is based around this drug ring that is making drugs and selling drugs, and their plots are so inane and nonsensical that it doesn't even make any sense even when it's explained. What these guys are doing is they are blackmailing an undocumented guy to have him stay in a different hotel room every night. And then two of the drug goons will watch him while he makes drugs for them, and all night. So he's literally not getting any sleep. And the bartender is also in on this. He gets drugs into the hotel, and then he gives them to Molly, and Molly takes them and a room key to the undocumented guy, and he doesn't tell her that any of this is going on. This is not how drugs work. If there are two guys staying up all night to watch him, then why aren't they making the drugs twice as fast instead of the one undocumented guy, whose name is also Juan Manuel, so thanks for that, Nita Prose. Oh my god. It makes no sense, even when Molly tells the lawyer, and the lawyer instantly figures it out and explains what's going on. It makes no sense. And in fact, it's not even the resolution to the fucking mystery, because you find out what's going on with this drug ring, and then you assume, oh, they must have killed the guy. And apparently, like, the entire justice system and every police officer also assumes, oh, so the drug dealers must have killed the guy, despite there being no evidence for it. And it turns out, actually, that a different person killed the rich guy who died in this book. It was his ex-wife, and Molly saw it and knew it the entire time, and decided to hide it on purpose. So we have a main character who is repeatedly presented as not knowing what she's doing in situations where she shouldn't know what she's doing, who's presented as making bad decisions in situations where she actually knows that she's making bad decisions, and who purposefully hides information from the police even when she's being questioned, and then basically gets people arrested for murder who didn't commit murder. So, go figure. This is a terrible book. It's a terribly put together character, and I absolutely cannot believe that we are apparently getting a sequel about the same character. Nita Prose, what the hell? How did you convince Stephen King and NPR that this is a good book? I might need that trick. Like, can you share that trick? It seems kind of useful. Are they all on powdered sugar or something? What? When you're a longtime mystery reader, like me, you're probably searching for the Holy Grail too. A book out there that somehow, impossibly, has no red herrings, no pointless tangents within the mystery, where everything collectively and seamlessly adds up into a beautiful conclusion, where all of the information that you're presented with is used and explored. And this book does come close. Like, it does do that, just not in the purest, most satisfying way. I'll give it props. It's a really hard thing to do in a murder mystery. I would know. I've tried to write some. And, this book manages to achieve it. So, nice job. If you decide to read this book, I feel like most of your investment is going to be in the characters anyway. I was very invested in the characters. I became invested in the characters over the course of the story, even though I was reading it for the plot. And I really enjoyed the way that it concluded. It felt comfortable, it felt cozy, it felt very sweet. I also thought the plot was pretty clever. It wasn't like all the way there. I will say that most of the information that we get in this book is used, but it's used for like preliminary things that you need to know in order to solve the mystery. Which is, you know, one of the only ways that you can actually do this, but it still isn't quite as satisfying as if it was, as if it all added up into some cohesive unit. What I'm trying to say is, while all the information is useful, not all of it is important. And that's sad. And, you know, that's fine. I like this for the characters anyway, and I keep going in circles about the plot. The plot is pretty good, and that's about the most that I can say about it. At the very least, I'm definitely not going to give it away, and if you'd like a fun, character-centric mystery, I would suggest you read this book. I don't know if I'll read anything else by Jessie Sutanto, but now that I'm aware of the way that she writes, I might try it out. I will say, I feel like I should alert you of this. This book does something interesting, which is it has chapters not only from the perspective of Vera, who's in the role of the detective, but also all the different suspects that she's interrogating. And that will sometimes give you hints and information that's not been revealed yet, and it adds, I guess, a little bit more of a thriller quality to this book. And it's honestly not half bad. The weird thing is that all the chapters are written in third-person present tense, which is very rare. You don't see it a lot, and that's because it's awkward. So the reading experience is a bit awkward for this book, but if you can deal with that, you know, you'll be fine. It's a good book. I would recommend. Are you wondering why middle grade is a different category than the rest of sci-fi and fantasy, given that that's pretty much all the books in here? Simple answer. I read too many middle grade books this year, so they got their own group. Beowulf was a children's graphic novel that I read this year. It's not really clear what age range it's targeted to, since you can enjoy it at literally any age. This book comes from the creators of the children's book, not graphic novel, Augie and the Green Knight, which is a retelling of Gawain and the Green Knight, with slightly more sarcasm and imagination. Beowulf, on the other hand, is a faithful adaptation of the first third of the English epic poem Beowulf, and it is committed to that task. In this book, the original story of the hero Beowulf saving Nordic lords and fighting monsters is adapted into the story of Beowulf, who's a 5 or 6 year old girl living in suburbia who defeats an evil adult who wants to turn all of the kids into adults, make them grow up, and destroy their treehouse home. It's a very fun take on the story of Beowulf that you wouldn't necessarily get in any kind of adaptation, and I kind of love the amount of focus that it puts on the children who are the main characters. It's super valuable. Not only does this adaptation use the original story of Beowulf, it also uses the style and language in a really creative way. The language is inspired by the style of poetry that's used in Beowulf. So it has basically 2-part lines with a lot of alliteration and something called kennings, which is kind of like linguistic riddles. The best example that I can think of is the shoreless sea is talking about the sky. That's a very vaguely well-known kenning, but there are also a whole lot more, and you can make them up whenever you want, and they appear all through this book. They are super well used. The language in this book is so interesting to read, and I really loved it. It's lyrical and enjoyable, and it really enhances the story. It's obviously a fantasy story, you know, since it's Beowulf, and Beowulf is a fantasy story, but I still like the way that things are adapted, and the way that it is sort of honest with the source material. For instance, there's this part in Beowulf where one of the Thanes, I believe, starts making fun of Beowulf for losing a swimming race, and Beowulf starts talking about all these sea monsters that he fought. And, you know, this is the kind of thing that you could just leave out of an adaptation. It's not relevant to the story. Or you could, you know, adapt it into something that a child would do. But no, instead, Beowulf starts talking about the 7 lake monsters that she fought during a swimming race. I love that it's faithful enough to the source material while still maintaining the vibe that it's trying to go for. That is a really cool thing to accomplish. And there was sequel baiting at the end. Because it only covered the first third of Beowulf up until he defeated Grendel, or should I say, up until Beowulf defeated Grendel, there is an opportunity for future Beowulf sequels featuring Grendel's mother and some dragon, because also in Beowulf he beat Grendel's mother and a dragon. So, I'm excited for it. I hope we get it. I would totally read it. I'd highly recommend this book. The Keeper series. I just have to smile every time I think about these books. Every time somebody mentions the word keepers or one of the characters' names or an attribute that vaguely reminds me of keepers, I go into this kind of spiraling fantasy about all the things I like about keepers and how other literature should also be using the same kind of ideas. The Keeper series is my favorite series of books, and that is kind of as of this year, but also like it was kind of destined to be for a while. I read the first book quite a while ago. At some point, for some reason, I was asked to read some advanced reader copies at my local library, and I'm pretty sure Keepers was one of them, but I'm not 100% sure because the cover wasn't the cover of the advanced reader copy. And of course I know that because I'm a Keepers fan. The way that I found it is irrelevant, because the point is, at the time I first read it, it was a new book. I was not really old enough to have the experience to tell the difference between a really good book and a pretty good book. So I didn't notice how high Keepers should have stood amid the other middle grade fiction that I was reading at that time. But, oh my god, Keepers is excellent. A few years ago, I came back to book 1. I read book 2 and book 3 gradually, and I finally got around to reading book 4 this year, and I am so glad that I did. Because not only was it a beautiful conclusion to the series, but it kind of plunged me into being a full-on Keepers fan. I consider TSTK, Ted Sanders the Keepers, to be my main fandom, which is great, because it's my main fandom, and I'm its main human, and there's basically nobody else there, which is a felony. Everything about these books is so beautiful and well executed and carefully put together. I am in love with the characters, and their character arcs are super intricate and complicated and based on interactions with the other characters. Just, I don't know, some of my favorite characters. Isabel is so interesting. I talked a lot in this video about how the only way I can get invested in a character is if I like them or I think they're interesting. Most of the time, it's because I like them. Isabel's the one I think is interesting. I want to punch her in the face, but she is so intriguing, and so I will wait and see what she does, and see how she interacts with the other characters to move the plot forward in such a cool way. Chloe and Brian, super solid. I enjoy them whenever they're on the page. They're always true to their personalities, and weird, and cool, and confident. Well, especially Chloe's confident. Brian has some stuff with that, and that's what makes him interesting. Joshua, I want to hug. He's so sweet. I care so much about Joshua, and Neptune is so funny, and I want more of her. All the characters are so interesting and complicated that it just brings these books to life. The world building and the magic system is the best direction I have ever seen a soft magic system take in my life. I am normally very anti-soft magic because I think soft magic means that the writer doesn't feel like they have to explain things. But really what soft magic is it doesn't necessarily have super definite rules. And Ted Sanders actually understands how to do this because he just has... The way that the magic in these books work is that there are a couple of magical items, and way more magical items get revealed over the course of the series, and they all do different and very specific things. But the ones that you see the most are well established enough that you will understand how they interact and play off each other. And that means that the author can use them for battle scenes, to explain what's going on in a battle scene and make everything so much more tense, to foreshadow things, to show how characters are tough, and the way that he matches the magic properties of an item to the traits of its owner is awesome. Like, it's a really smart idea, and it also tells you so much more about the characters that helps you get invested in them. And that's why it's so cool. I haven't even talked about the plot yet. And the plot of these books... Okay, I should separate the basic plot from the battle scene plot because there are a couple things I'm talking about here. The regular plot of the books is engaging and fun and keeps you interested for the most part. I'll talk about that in a second. But the battle sequences, what I'm talking about plot here, I'm talking about the fact that the author is clearly keeping track of where everyone is, what they're doing, like, to the foot, to the minute. He knows where and when everything is happening during a battle scene. He shows you that information in the way that the characters interact and in the way that it switches character perspectives during some of the more tense battles, especially in book 3. And everything feels super intricate and well planned. For an example of this, there's a very early battle scene in chapter 11 or 12 of the first book, which I spent some time analyzing and looking over to see if I could figure out what was going on. I read over the 2 chapters where the battle takes place, and from that I was able to get almost down to the 5-minute intervals when everything happened, what day it was, because you can actually work through the books to find out when things happen, and I found out like exactly what the main character's neighborhood looked like and what routes all of the different people in the battle we're taking around the neighborhood. That is how much effort he puts into even the smallest confrontations. And I really respect that. But the last thing that I have to talk about these books is how they try and keep you engaged. Because these books respect the reader, they care about the reader, and they treat the reader with a kind of understanding that you don't see in a lot of other books. For one thing, these books have a very strong focus on curiosity, the importance of trying to find things out and discovering things on your own. There's whole modes of analysis where you can look at how important curiosity is as a trait in the main character, in the magic system, in the plot in general, and the book appeals to the reader's curiosity as well. It brings up mysteries and questions and different paths which the reader can think about. And the way that it hooks you into the next book is not like, oh, we're about to start a dangerous battle, will we survive? It's, hey, do you want to know more about how the world works? And then it delivers. Because every book of this manages to expand the scope bigger and bigger with a more complicated magic system and background and world, so that as time goes on, you start to understand the full picture of how the world works, how all of the characters are interacting with that, and why that's important to the battles they're fighting. The stakes transition smoothly from saving family members to fighting bad guys to saving the world, and it all makes sense and feels natural. But the book doesn't hook you with those stakes. It hooks you with, hey, are you curious who made this magic object? Do you want to know if the head of the secret organization is keeping secrets? And if you are interested, then you can pick up the next book, and it will tell you, if not everything you want to know, the next level of information that needs to be revealed to you to understand the plot. You might expect this from the way that I've been talking about these books, but they are my highest recommendation on this list so far and going forward. I love these books, I think you will love these books, and I think that they care about you enough to warrant that. Also, I started the fan wiki, so if anyone reads these books, like I said you should, and wants to come to the Ted Sanders the Keeper's fan wiki, it exists now. Please help, I need help. Running a wiki is hard. I didn't know that, but usually these kinds of things are put together by at least 10 fans, not one. Hi. The first book in the series is called The Box and the Dragonfly. I have pictures of the books here so you can find them, and I will also put the title of the book in the description so that you can find it and you get the right one. I'm not recommending it so I can have people to talk to. I genuinely think this book is amazing and more people should read it. Please do. You guys ready to talk about Warrior Cats? Because I've read so much of it this year, and now you're going to hear about it whether you want to or not. Although if you don't, you know, here's a time code. Wimp. Warrior Cats, if you're not aware of it, is a hyper-popular middle grade series about cats who fight each other and live in the wilderness and have war for most often no reason. And there's lots of family and political drama. The best way that I find myself able to explain it is that it's kind of like if someone tried to make Game of Thrones for children. It's literally very much like that. There is secret family drama, there is politics and complicated political relations, there are mysteries that have to be solved over the course of each series of books, and it is obscenely long. There are, I believe, 46 main arc books out right now, and that is only half the books because the other half are tie-ins. I read a bunch of them this year, not all of them because who can, but I'll try and read the rest next year and let you know my thoughts on them. For right now, this is what I have. To start with, I read The Prophecies Begin. This is the original arc of Warrior Cats books, the first 6 books that got Warriors started, and were originally supposed to be a standalone series until they sold really well. These are like the basics, you know, they're introduction books. They tell you about the world and the characters, and in particular, they get you invested in the story with a really fun and engaging main character who feels heroic, but also feels like he has a lot on his plate.
Firestar is a great, fun character who never gets irritating and has to deal with real problems in real and complicated ways. And I feel like that's a good choice for your first main character. You can't really go wrong with this original thing. The mysteries are great, they're super intricate. I'm sure if I didn't know, like, the answers to all of them by heart, because they're kind of all throughout the rest of Warriors, that I would have been surprised and thrilled at the conclusions. And there was a lot of awesome drama and complexity in political alliances, and the kind of stuff that I normally find boring because it mostly consists of people being jerks to each other. But in these books, it's engaging and fun and presents challenges for the main characters. Of course there's problems, because there's problems with warrior cats. Of course, in this series of books, if you have read them or touched them ever in your life, you probably have the scene with Snowkit in A Dangerous Path tattooed into your frontal lobe. It's impossible to forget, and it was not fun for me to read as a kid, and it wasn't fun for me to read now. I don't even know what to say about it. If you're writing a book, don't do that. It was a stupid thing to do, and it made everybody sad and upset. It is important to remember, while that is a serious problem, it is only a very small part of these books, and it's not what I'm here to talk about today. It felt great to read these books. It was cozy, it was comfy, I liked it. I like these books. And I'm sorry that they are the way they are, in some cases. I also read Dawn of the Clans in July. You may notice that this Dawn of the Clans copy is shrink-wrapped, so I didn't read these specific books, I plead the fifth. This is the prequel story to Warriors, the story of how the original 5 clans came to be, and the tensions between the cats who founded them. I enjoyed these a lot. It's been a while since I read them, I think about 3 years. I did a big Warriors reread during the pandemic. Greywing, the protagonist, is really interesting. I like that they chose to not focus on a protagonist who becomes one of the clan leaders. There's a lot of shifting alliances in this series, which isn't normal for Warriors. Like, sometimes cats will change clans, but entire groups splitting and mixing and forming different groups is not something you see a lot in these books, or at least not in the original series. So it was really cool to see that here. Starflower, you know, she's in these books. She's kind of irritating when she's used as a plot device, but I like her, and I like the way that her character was explored when it was. I hope she shows up in a different book at some point. If you're not aware of this, this was also the first series that was written by the new writing team that Warriors got in, I believe, like 2014 or 15. And it was smart to start them on a story that didn't have any pre-established characters. And I think this story displays that they do know what they're doing. And so I've been maybe a little skeptical about the new series of Warriors that came out since Dawn of the Clans. I haven't read any of them yet, but now I'm feeling a little more comfortable with it. So I'll tell you about those next year. As for the super editions I read this year, the reason that you see some weird super editions here is because I was trying to read chronologically first, and then I decided to read in the recommended reading order. So that's why all of these are prequels, but there are like other stuff that aren't prequels in the rest of the reading order. So I read Blue Star's Prophecy, which I hadn't read in quite a long time. I don't think I read it since I was actually into Warriors as a kid. And I liked it. You know, it was a good book. I can see why people enjoyed it. And it made a lot of things more clear about Blue Star's history. It's not really presented super well in the books why she made the decision that she did. It doesn't make that much sense. But I guess they worked harder to make it make sense in this story. And I think it is better. Granted, I'm kind of resentful that some of it was because of Goosefeather, just because I think that anything which is because of Goosefeather, just because I think Goosefeather seems to have caused every problem in that era of ThunderClan, which, not a surprise, you know, he did. But I liked seeing young Bluefur, and I liked seeing her relationships with other cats. Granted, you know, she needs some friends. I knew that was a problem with this book. But the one friend that she does have, Thrushpelt, was such an amazing cat that it almost kind of makes up for it. And I'm not saying that totally, but I am so glad that we got a cat like Thrushpelt in Warriors. He is such a good, honest, kind, understanding cat. And he was thrilling to read, and now I want a Thrushpelt novella. Honestly, props. Every cat should be like this. He's solid. Crooked Star's Promise is another of these super editions that I don't really understand how it came to exist. Crooked Star was a very minor character in the original series, and this book came out like a few years afterwards, and for some reason they chose him to focus on, even though he's one of the less interesting characters who was presented in the original series. But I'm glad that they did, because of a couple of things. First off, Crooked Star is an interesting character. He's fun to read. His relationships with other characters are interesting to read. And second of all, we got 2 great female villains in this book. People are always talking about how Warriors doesn't have enough female villains, and like, no, not a lot of women are presented as outright villains who want to kill people, but there are still bad cats who are ladies. And we get an example in this book that I don't think is listed as a female villain most of the time, but Rainflower is definitely an antagonist, and she is Crooked Star's mom, and she is abusive and degrading of his disability, and the way that she treats him throughout the book is a really major source of conflict for him, and helps the reader understand the struggle that he's having in a more visible way than if it was just an internal struggle. I like her presence here. I hate the character. I want to throw her over the fence. I think she deserves it, but I'm glad she was here. She's an interesting villain. And then there's Mapleshade. I already mentioned Mapleshade. She's one of my favorite Warriors characters, and if I'm not mistaken, this was either her first book or it was written very shortly after she was introduced. And because of that, I'm glad that Crooked Star was chosen to focus on, so it actually made sense. And I was just glad for the Mapleshade content in this book. I'm always looking for that. Yellowfang's Secret is bad. That's not like a surprise. Everyone knows that who reads Warriors. For some reason, I read this book like several times. I definitely read it when I was starting Warriors, and I read it again during my pandemic reread, and I read it again now. And like, I don't know why, because every time I read it, I'm like, you know, that wasn't very good. There's basically nothing in here except interesting Broken Star backstory. So if you're looking for Broken Star's backstory, you can read this book, and after like about halfway through, you start actually getting Broken Star's backstory, but the rest of it is just pointless drama, unhealthy relationships that aren't written in interesting ways, and retcon psychic powers, which is a Warrior staple, but it's definitely a mood in this book. Now, in sharp contrast, Tallstar's Revenge was an excellent book. It may be one of the best Warriors books that I have read so far, and not even just this year. Why did I never notice how good this book was before? It has an interesting arc for the main character. He goes from edgy and dark to forgiving and noble and interesting. The relationships are well established. I love his interactions with all the rest of the people in his clan, and how you can both see Tallstar's perspective of how uncaring people are for what he's going through, but also, like, they have no obligation to have the same emotional reaction that he does. I love that you can see it from both perspectives, and that's not something you get a lot in middle grade books, especially Warriors books. And also, this is like the only good Warriors romance I've ever read, I swear. Just more effort into my ongoing discovery that gay relationships are more interesting to read than straight relationships, because gay relationships always have a reason to be there. Tallstar and Jake, I can see why so many people like this ship. It's fun to read, fun to write about, probably fun to make AUs about. And the little comic that they put into the back of the super editions in this one actually made me cry. Which, like, I cry a lot, but that's still an achievement. Like, nice job. It was emotional and fun to read. I also read the 2 Dawn of the Clans super edition prequels, and yeah, they're very different. Mothflight's vision makes no sense to me whatsoever. Everything in the book is designed to be put together in order to construct the medicine cat code that's going to go on for a long time. And yet, it's like the most backhanded way that you would put something like this together. Like, everything that happens in the books is kind of evidence of why the medicine cat code doesn't make any sense. I'm sure there's a better way that they could have done this. Maybe they could have, I don't know, used Mothflight's ADHD to demonstrate why it is actually hard to take on childcare and healthcare duties at the same time. But of course, because they forgot that she has ADHD, after she met a boyfriend. They could not do this. They shot themselves in the foot. This is why, while I respect Mothflight's inclusion as a neurodivergent character in Warriors, I think it would have been cool if, like, she was actually neurodivergent, and I won't be interested in the character because the character was nothing aside from the neurodivergence, and removing it made her boring. Which is not something you want in any kind of representation, and is especially not something that you want if you're trying to write an interesting book about a character. Mothflight's vision was bad. Like, I don't even think there's a way to debate that. I don't know. Yeah, it was bad. Also, you know, if you like Windstar, there's Windstar stuff in here, so I guess that's a draw. Meanwhile, Riverstar's Home was really interesting to me. From what I've seen, this is a book that came out this year. From what I've seen, I don't think people liked it very much, but I gotta disagree. I thought it was a fun, engaging book, and I thought that Riverstar was genuinely an interesting character. Like, in the books, he's very mysterious, you don't get to see a lot of him, and he's honestly not super well defined. He seems like kind of zen, chill guy, and you don't get to see, like, his internal monologue. And in this book, where you actually do get to see it, you can see that he's using his training of trying to be calm and chill in order to avoid thinking about things that he doesn't want to think about and keep his cool in dangerous situations, despite not really having that come naturally. And I think that's actually kind of cool, to see a different side of the character that he never lets the rest of the world see. Also, his interactions with Night were great. I just like Night. I want a book about Night, frankly. It's been hinted that Warriors Arc 9 might cover some of the time between Dawn of the Clans and the prequel super editions, and if I were to see that, I would want a book about Nightstar. I'm super down for that. Also, I think the conclusion of Riverstar's Home and how he used his new leader powers in a particular context was really cool. It's almost what I wish had happened at the end of The Prophecies Begin, because Firestar did not do what Riverstar did, and he should have, and it would have been really cool and satisfying. The one criticism I have about Riverstar's Home is there's this part where the cats run through a mall, which doesn't make any sense since this book is supposed to take place in the early mid-1900s. So I don't know if people forgot about that, but, like, there weren't shopping malls. Not like the one that's described in the book. That's wrong. Sorry. Finally, I want to say something about The Rise of Scourge, the short manga, which I read this year, even though it's coming out in color in like 3 months and I probably should have waited. I think this was kind of bad. You know, I won't say no to a little more Scourge content and a sad, dramatic backstory, but I gotta say, like, if you're going to cover The Rise of Scourge, you gotta cover The Rise of Scourge. You can't just start with Scourge being a wimp and then skip to him being in charge. You have to explain how he actually got good at fighting. This book never takes the time to explain how he got good at fighting. And somehow, because this is Warriors and it doesn't get, like, extra special content on the reprint, I don't think that's going to be explained in the new color reprint either, but I guess I'll check just to make sure, you know, just in case it's good. I also read a bunch of Warriors novellas this year. These are short books, like less than 100 pages, so they're going to get short descriptions. Cloudstar's Journey was a bittersweet story. It was very obviously a tie-in to Firestar's Quest, and I haven't gotten to Firestar's Quest in my reread yet, so it was probably a mistake to read that right now. But, you know, I liked it. It was well executed. Mapleshade's Vengeance was awesome. Oh, yeah, Mapleshade is awesome. Mapleshade is awful. I think so much of the stuff that happens in this particular story is a result of this really interesting characterization that she had. Earlier in this video, I said that Satan is like Mapleshade, and they're similar in the way that they try and justify their own actions and blame others for the things that happen to them. So I think that's really interesting. Also, I found this Mapleshade pin. I was walking outside my office and I heard something clink and she'd stabbed me in the shoe, which is very in character, so of course it's Mapleshade. Goosefeather's Curse was, you know, a tie-in to Blue Star's Prophecy, I find it weird that, like, some of the stuff in Goosefeather's Curse isn't in any of the other ThunderClan novellas or super editions, because I would think that it would be important enough to be in there, but, you know. This story is mostly just about how poor decisions can have lasting consequences. I do think Dostar, I believe it was Dostar who put Goosefeather in such an important position at such a young age. I think she's an idiot. That was a dumb thing to do. And, of course, it had so many lasting consequences over the rest of the series. Thanks ThunderClan starving, thanks Moonflower's death, thanks everything that Blue Star went through. But at least we got Featherwhisker at some point. This and Blue Star's prophecy and Spottedleaf's heart just made me realize how level-headed Featherwhisker is and how much more appreciation he deserves. How much that cat had to deal with. As for Pine Star's choice, look, I read the novella, which was from his perspective, so that's intended to show us where he's coming from. And after reading it, success! I understand where he's coming from. I still think he's bad at his job, and he should have been fired instead of quitting. But, you know, it doesn't really matter because he left anyway. Pine Star was just bad leader. Like, I don't even care that he broke the code before it was actually a code. He did a bad job, and so it is actually his fault. Thunderstar's Echo doesn't seem to get a lot of love, but I like this story. I thought it was a great story. I knew that this thing that happened in the story was going to happen because it's kind of half revealed in a field guide when they're talking about who some of the early ThunderClan leaders were, but I'm glad that we actually got to find out how this happened because it was genuinely emotional and I enjoyed it. I thought it was good. Solid. Nice job. Shadowstar's life doesn't make any sense to me. Like, that was a complete contextless character assassination for Quickwater. I don't understand why there's this whole thing in here about her. It doesn't seem like the kind of thing that a cat would do anywhere in the series. You know, if Shadowstar wasn't ever gonna get a perspective, I would be sad, though. So I guess I'm glad that Shadowstar got a perspective because she deserved one, but, like, why was it this? This doesn't really feel right. And then there's Spottedleaf's heart. If you have read this story, if you are into Warriors fandom enough to know about this story, you know what I'm gonna say, and you know that I don't need to say it. If you are not involved with Warriors, or don't know what I'm going to say, don't look into it, and don't read this story. If you're thinking of reading Warriors, skip this one. This may be the only story that I'm suggesting that you skip, because it adds literally nothing to the plot overall of Warriors. It adds literally nothing to Spottedleaf's character, and it actively makes so many things that happen in... And it actively makes everything so much worse. I don't like this story, obviously. Nobody does. I don't understand why Victoria Holmes would ever have chosen to do this. I think it is a felony. If something doesn't add to the story, is not comfortable, and you're not even going to portray it correctly, and it's not appropriate for children, don't write it. This story should not exist. And I don't want to talk about it further right now because I said these would be quick summaries. I guess if you want me to make a video about it, I can yell about it for 20 minutes, but I already did that for a book. I already did that for Name of the Wind, which is 20 times the size of this story. So I don't want to do it for this. I'm tired of it. No, just don't read this story. It sucks on so many levels. So, you've already heard me talk about Warrior Cats for at least 20 minutes. I'm very familiar with those books. They're a throwback to my childhood. Wings of Fire is not. These books are kind of like an equivalent series to Warriors, except they focus on dragons instead of cats, and it's a totally dragon-based world. The reason that I draw such a strong comparison is because Tui T. Sutherland was at one point on the team that wrote Warriors, and she did end up contributing to one Warriors book and a couple books from this series about bears, which no one read. Afterwards, Tui Sutherland decided to write her own book series about dragons, and she does it all herself. That means that she has total creative control over a lot of it, and to my knowledge, there's also a lot more internal consistency, even if the books don't necessarily come out as often. There's strength in that, and that's why I like this first Wings of Fire book. Granted, I can't really judge the consistency since I've only read one book. I will say, this book wasn't in the slightest what I was expecting it to be. It's a take on a prophecy which I actually haven't seen before in most of the books that I've read. It was refreshingly original in that way. It was refreshingly original in the weird and unusual designs that it uses for dragons. I will say that the way this book handled humans was weird and uncomfortable, but I guess that's just a creative choice, and I can't imagine how else they would have done it. I think maybe they should just not have included humans in these books. You get a really good sense for the different characters in this book, and they feel the age that they're meant to be. I think they're supposed to be about 6 years old, but since they're dragons, that scales up. So they're teenagers, kind of? You can tell that they don't really know what the world is like yet, and you can see their flaws, but you can also see how they can use those to their strengths. One of the things that I liked about this book is that the main character, Clay, is kind of admittedly not that smart, not that strong, not that good at anything in particular. But through him being open-minded and willing to talk to different people and make friends, he is able to save them nonetheless. And that is a really strong idea. I'm very curious about the rest of the Wings of Fire books. This is the only one I've read so far, so I'll probably read more next year, and you'll get to see a complete newbie's reaction to these books, which probably doesn't happen that often given how ubiquitous they are. One of the things that I'm noticing as I try and make notes on some of the nonfiction books I read this year is it's kind of hard to make notes on nonfiction books. Like, there's no plot or characters or storytelling devices that I can analyze, so I guess I'll just go with shorter summaries without any distinct sections or anything. I don't really have much to say about any of these, so I'll just share what I have. I like The Bastard Brigade. This is a Sam Kean book, and I've read other books by Sam Kean. I enjoy his writing style, and I think the sheer amount of research that he puts into his science history books speaks for itself. I think this book was kind of long, but, it was definitely well-researched. It was definitely impressive. Some parts of it strike me more as, like, creative nonfiction. If you're a World War II buff, or if you're interested in stuff from this era, I would suggest that you read this book, because it's covering a particular topic that you may not have seen before, and it's very informational. So, good review. I'm looking forward to reading The Tale of the Dueling Neurosurgeons this year, and then I'll have read all of his books. Black Hole by Marcia Bartusiak, I read sometime this summer, I don't remember when, and I liked it, but I don't actually remember that much about it. I guess it wasn't very memorable. I don't mean to be offensive, just like, I guess I already knew some of the stuff in here. Maybe that's why I had the reaction to it that I did. But I didn't think it was a bad book. I remember thinking it was a good book. So if you're interested in black holes, it might be worth a read. Dark Matter and the Dinosaurs is a book by Lisa Randall, who is a professor of theoretical physics at Harvard, and this is kind of like an overview in the greatest possible detail of a theory that she came up with a few years ago about where the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs might have come from and what caused it. If you are interested in this theory, then you should probably read this book, but otherwise, it's not really going to be a generally helpful popular science book. It's not an overview. It's just like goes into every possible detail and tangent and explanation about this one theory that will help you understand it in itself. You'll probably learn some interesting stuff in the course of reading this book. I will, but it also probably won't have much application outside of what the author is trying to share with you. This year, I finally got around to reading Diary of a Young Girl, the original diary of Anne Frank, and I realize why I have been told my whole life that this is a book that everyone should read. I think it is absolutely a book that everyone should read. Now, I hope you're familiar with the background of this book, but if you aren't, I'll just go into it briefly. During the Holocaust, there were a number of Jewish families who, instead of fleeing occupied areas, instead decided to hide and see if they could wait it out. Anne Frank's family and the additional family that stayed with her family was one of these groups. They lived in the Netherlands, and when it was occupied, some friends of theirs offered to hide them in the hidden upstairs area of their home, and took precautions to make sure that Nazis couldn't find them. Unfortunately, the precautions did not hold, and after several years of living in complete hiding and never being able to go outside, Anne and her family were captured by Nazi soldiers and taken to a concentration camp where they were murdered. The Holocaust ended very soon afterward, and Anne's diary was recovered and published. This book is the admittedly translated version of her exact words which she wrote in her private diary. So it wouldn't be right of me to make any kind of comment on the quality of this book or its writing style, because it was never meant to be read. Nonetheless, I will say that I was surprised at the maturity and the grace that came through in her words, and it did emotionally affect me quite a bit, and I think it will if you read it as well. This book wasn't at all what I expected. It was so much more personal and deep and innocent, and there's such value in that. I would highly recommend that you read this book. Hi, I'm kind of white. It's kind of obvious. So when I can, I try and get alternate perspectives. This book is called The Disordered Cosmos, and it is the story of a woman of color who works in the field of physics and who is, what's her title exactly? She is an assistant professor at the University of New Hampshire. Her name is Chanda Prescod-Weinstein. And while I did learn about Dr. Prescod-Weinstein's experiences over the course of this book, I didn't get out of it when I wanted to get out of it, which is too bad. When I read these kinds of books, as a person who is not impacted by some of the things that she was sharing, I want to find a way that I can help or a way that I can be supportive to people who do go through some of those things. And sadly, I just didn't get this out of this book. It was pretty negative, it was pretty depressed. And I can see why, given some of the things that she wanted to share that she went through. But, you know, I guess it's just the kind of person I am. I want to find a way to help, and I guess I'm just sorry that I wasn't able to find in here a way that I could help or be supportive. I guess what I would say about this book is I didn't feel like I learned very much, and I didn't feel like I had a good experience reading it. Oh well. I guess one other thing I should mention about this book is that it took a moment to stop and insult Lisa Randall. Lisa Randall being the author of the Dark Matter book that I shared with you a few minutes ago. Now, what this book said was basically something that Lisa Randall said about dark matter being representative of the commitment and contributions of scientists of color over history was a weird and nonsensical thing for her to say, and it was dumb of her to say it. Now, I agree that this was a weird and nonsensical thing for her to say, given two things. First off, dark matter is literally invisible, and second off, there is no way that dark matter will ever contribute in a visible or electromagnetic way to the universe, so that we know of. And I feel like an issue like scientists of color not getting credit for their work or not being respected for the ideas that they come up with is something that we should actively be trying to fix, and not just saying, oh, that's so weird, it's invisible, like something in science. Point is, I don't think it was very smart of Lisa Randall to say it, but I don't know why this book goes so intensely against herself, and not just the idea. One of the things that I've just learned in the experience of my life is that sometimes people are being bigots and sometimes they're being dumb. And I think Lisa Randall said a dumb thing, but I don't think that means she's bigoted, and I don't see why this book is so mad at her. That was kind of the general attitude of the book on a couple of different things. I'm pointing this out not to vindicate Lisa Randall, who, by the way, did admit to insulting a child in her own book, but just to display the attitude of this book in general, which I feel like is something you should know about it if you choose to read it. If you know like a moderate to decent amount about math, and you're aware of Graham's number and have looked up many things about how to visualize and mentally understand Graham's number in any conceivable way, well, you're like me in that respect, because I've done the same thing, and that's why I got this book. This is about a whole bunch of very weird numbers, and in fact, each section of the book is based on a number. Here are the numbers that are featured in this book. 1.00000000000000000000858, a Googleplex, Graham's number, tree 3, 0, 0.000000000000000001, and 10 to the negative 120th power. Also infinity. Now, what I thought this book would do was just explain to me how I could understand these numbers and how I could like mentally visualize them and stuff like that. And granted, there are sections about that in the Graham's number and tree 3 chapters, because most of the dialogue around those numbers in science is just about that. Nonetheless, that isn't really what this book is about. Most of it is explaining the physics context of each particular number and the background to why it's there and how it's discovered, and in the case of some of the discrepancies, maybe how we can fix it. I like that because it was a perspective I hadn't really seen before on some of the numbers. I feel like I learned some things, which I don't necessarily see a lot in pop science. I also like the way that the book was written. So, I think this is a good book. I'm just letting you know what it is so that you won't be surprised, because it's not really what's advertised. This is a physics book which uses numbers as a lens through which to look at physics. It's not a book about understanding numbers. And if you want to figure out how to visualize Graham's number, then just watch this guy's YouTube, because he does that on his YouTube. Frequently Asked Questions About the Universe is a relatively short book, from what I remember, which I don't have with me, and which was written, I believe, by Jorge Cham and Daniel Whiteson. One of them drew the pictures, I don't know which one, but I believe they both wrote the text. I don't know if they have a webcomic. They've definitely written a book before that also has cartoons in it, but this isn't actually a cartoon book. It's just a book which relies on some cartoon pictures, kind of like What If. I like that kind of thing, so I like this book, but I also think the more valuable thing about this book is that it's presented in a very public-facing and friendly way. Everything is very clear, and there's a whole wide range of topics covered. This is meant to be kind of frequently asked questions about the universe. I would also say this is a very useful reference guide for anyone who's writing science fiction, because it talks about things like time travel and wormholes and black holes in ways that are understandable for people without backgrounds in science. I really like the book, I would highly recommend it, and I might even read something else of theirs, which I don't always do with nonfiction books. As for Fuzz by Mary Roach, she's a very well-received author, and I do think she presents things well, so I can see why that is. But this book just had the same problems for me as The Disordered Cosmos did, which is, it was very depressing. It didn't actually really talk very much about what people are doing to try and avoid some of the bad things that happened in this book, or how you can help try to avoid some of the bad things in this book. It's a book about animal-human interaction, and that covers a whole lot of different bases, from pests in cities to murders committed by animals, to car accidents, to just general animal-human interaction in other cases, and why it usually doesn't end very well. Oh well, yeah, it was a sad book. I didn't really enjoy reading it, and I was sorry to hear about some of the things that happened in it, and I wish that I could have known what I could do about it. And finally, in nonfiction, we have This Way to the Universe by Michael Dine. Now, I had a conversation with Dr. Dine in 2023, and he was very helpful and understanding, so I decided to read his book and see how it was. And I like this book a lot. It's also, I feel like, very understanding, and it explains things pretty well, if not to like the highest level of popularization. This book is not necessarily a popular science book, in that I think it expects you to have a little bit more of a background, but if you don't, you could still probably figure out what's going on if you read carefully. The most valuable thing about this book, though, is that it covers almost every different field that's being explored right now and the forefronts of what happened in it. And it's a super recent book, published in 2022. The praise on the back is from people I've heard of and not as authors. Physicists think that this book is super up-to-date and knows what it's talking about, so that's a good sign. If you have a bit of a background in physics, or if you don't but are really curious about it, then this could be a good book that you could read to figure out what's going on right now. And finally, sci-fi. Unfortunately, I must regrettably share with you that I haven't saved my angriest rants for last, but trust me, there still will be some in here. This is dumb, but like, if you are printing a sci-fi or fantasy book and you want a regular paperback and a mass market paperback, don't make one that's slightly too big and one that's slightly too small. So I went into the bookstore and didn't notice that the one I had at home was a different size than the one that I was buying. Make them actually different sizes. I don't know why I care so much about that. It's just mildly frustrating. Thankfully, I won't have to worry about these books because I'm not interested in reading any more of them. Dune is an old and very well-respected sci-fi series, which is about I can barely even describe what it's about because it's so overcomplicated and confusing, but a lot of people seem to like it, and it's got a new movie, which was fine, I guess. At the very least, it was more engaging than the book. I don't want to rip into the first one too much, because while I didn't like it, I also understand that it's the kind of situation where I just got frustrated with it, and I didn't have the patience for it, and it wasn't for me. The second one, however, is objectively bad. So I'll talk about the first one first. This book has kind of a weird and convoluted premise. It is in space in the far future, and humanity has really poor technology. And not even in like a 60s sci-fi way poor technology. Like, they purposefully sabotage themselves. There was a historical event which is referred to a couple of times in the book called the Butlerian Jihad, where for some reason, which I'm not aware of, a bunch of people got mad that computers existed and they went around and destroyed all of the computers. And so now there are no computers and no one is ever allowed to use a computer. All the advancement comes from basically biological means and the human brain, and whatever way people can use to advance that. So there are whole secret societies and fields of education built around honing your brain to be like the finest, most precise, most exacting instrument possible. There's a society called the Bene Gesserit, which are a whole bunch of women who try to get involved as much as possible in events and manipulate them to make them go their way. And the Bene Gesserit have this ability called the Voice, which is basically a precursor of the Force from Star Wars. This book inspired a lot of Star Wars. The Voice is like a Jedi mind trick, except it's actually explained how it works. When you use the Voice on somebody, you are modulating your own voice to the exact pitches and inflections that will make the other person subconsciously decide to do what you want. It's weird, but like, I guess if humanity has spent thousands of years trying to understand their brains to the deepest level possible, they could figure out a way to do this. It's an interesting premise, but it's not really one that gets used very much because it quickly goes from the precise and neurological into the deeply and confusingly esoteric. The style of this book is also very esoteric. There are a whole lot of made-up words, which is not always a bad thing, but if you flick to a random page and read what's on it, you probably will not recognize what is being talked about. Nonetheless, if you open the book and try and read a page without knowing what's going on, it will probably be overwhelmingly confusing. The reason why this is bad is because the author takes almost no time to establish anything that actually happens in the book. Take the hunter-seekers as an example. A hunter-seeker is not a person doing a job. It's a small piece of metal that will try to get into your body and kill you from the inside. It's kind of horrifying. It's mentioned a few times before it becomes relevant. Then there's a scene with it where it's briefly explained what it is. Then it's mentioned a couple of other times. Because this happens with most of the stuff in the book, and because it seems like the author often forgets to include the explanation part, the book is very confusing and hard to get through. Also, there's a lot of just made up and overcomplicated words that aren't actually world building. I don't have anything against flowery writing. I just think if it's actively confusing, maybe you could try something else. For instance, this example that I randomly picked from some part in the book. It mentions a sandblast storm. Now, in the context that it's presented, I have no idea whether that's a technical term for a specific type of storm, which is not actually explained in the book, or if it's a figurative term for what the storm would be like. If you can't really tell that in a book, then maybe your world building isn't clear enough for the reader to understand. I should also mention that the world building that the author is trying to explain here just doesn't really make sense. This is a far future world with lots of spaceships and a whole bunch of different planets, and yet it's an empire with almost a system of feudalism. Like there's lords and dukes who are in charge of different planets and trade the planets between them, usually without the people on them having any kind of input into it. They can just get new government given to them by an emperor that they have never seen ever, and it will change their entire way of life, and they have no control over it. It's just not a very futuristic and positive system of government, which maybe that's part of the point, but like, how did this happen? How did humanity revert back to this? You can even see the contrast in the different groups of people here. The main characters are of high birth. They're lords. Their names are, the main character's name is Paul, and his mom's name is Jessica. They're very normal names that we will be familiar with. And then you go on to the planet, and the people who live on the planet get unique fantasy names, like Kynes and Chani. It makes the normal names of the main characters feel out of place and awkward. It's weird reading about a sci-fi fantasy hero whose name is Paul. The plot is fine, I guess. It's kind of a white savior thing. I don't really understand how the main characters are able to, I guess, ascend in the ways that they are. Like I mentioned, the original world building of very complicated things that the characters can do with their brains goes in a really weird direction with the mind-altering drug that this planet produces, spice melange, which is the entire point of why this planet is important. Once the characters start taking this, they gain weird powers that they barely even seem to know how they can use. And that kind of ruins the premise a little bit of the book. I mean, the premise is barely established before we start going into that, so I don't know if it ruins it or just takes it in a weird direction, but because I don't understand how the characters' powers work, and because I don't understand how the world works or why it works that way, I have trouble finding the conflict in this book compelling. Now the sequel... Okay, I should mention, I read the introduction of this book, which is in the beginning of it, and it starts with talking about how Dune Messiah is the most misunderstood of Frank Herbert's novels. Then it went on to talk about how various people did not like this book because they thought that the main character kind of turned bad, and they didn't like that the main character turned bad and that he was flawed. I don't have a problem with this because frankly it was foreshadowed a whole lot in the first book, and you know, I kind of expected him to be more of a negative force, that had to be resisted. After all, he was supposed to end up as like a religious figure that a whole bunch of people revered, and then they were going to start a religious war over him. He didn't want this to happen, but he couldn't really see a way out of it because his prophecy vision doesn't make any sense. Because the book started like that, talking about how that was and how the main character was flawed, I was going into it expecting for him to kind of become the bad guy and either, figure out a way to stop himself from doing this thing, or maybe we'd get the perspective of other characters who would stop him from starting this war. That's not really what happened. Most of the focus was still on Paul, but like as a bad guy, but he's not really a bad guy because you saw his personality in the first book and you still care about him, even though, he's made a whole lot of mistakes and now he's a tragic character and he's going to die tragically and, you're not going to have to worry about it. This book is full of a lot of nonsense. The world building gets expanded in some extremely confusing and difficult to understand ways. There are suddenly shapeshifters, which doesn't really make sense because, like I said, everything in these books was kind of reliant on the idea that humanity could do incredible things with their minds if they used them. But I don't understand how shapeshifters are able to happen. I guess maybe they were genetically engineered. It's not really clear. They make a clone of one of the characters, which I guess is allowed, and it's clear that like he's actually a clone and he has some subconscious task which has been implanted into him by the shapeshifter guys. Except later on in the plot of the book, he somehow breaks through that programming without totally realizing it's there and just becomes the guy that he was the clone of. It doesn't really make that much sense. Also, there's this really weird part. It's always got to be weird, isn't it? So there's this, I want to say she's 14 or 15 in this book. There's a girl whose name is Alia. Alia is Paul's sister, and she was born like soon after his mom took the magic spice drug. And because of that, she got like all her mom's memories and awareness when she was a baby. So she's kind of freaky and weird and not totally normal or human. And that's played up very much in these books. But the point is that she is 16 and she does have a romance arc with this clone. Now he is a clone of an adult man who is at least 35. I want to say he's in his 40s at least. So first off, it's weird that she's falling in love with an adult man, but then of course because Frank Herbert has got to do this in the most convoluted way possible, he's got to make it weird in the other direction, because the clone has only been alive for like 6 months. So this is somehow uncomfortable in both ways. I don't understand why it's here, because the weird inhuman character could have been amplified as such by just not having an unnecessary romance arc that happens to every woman in books from this era. But, he could also do this for some reason. The plot of this book kind of reaches a climax when, through some kind of trickery, people finally manage to get close to Paul and drop an atomic bomb. And I guess because of the way that this bomb works, there are some people who die, but like Paul's too far away from the blast radius to die, but the radiation is super targeted or something, so he just goes blind and is not hurt in any other way. I don't know if this is a real thing. I haven't heard of it before, but it seemed like a very weird plot device. It's like a blindness bomb. Anyway, Paul goes blind, but it's fine, don't worry. This is the dumbest use of the blind but not actually blind trope that I've ever seen in my entire life. And the reason for this is that Paul is blind, but he uses his magic prophecy vision to like have a prophecy of what's going on at the exact moment when he's doing something, so that he can just literally see what's going on anytime without having to worry about it. His prophecy vision covers his blindness. The problem that I don't understand is if it's that good and specific, then why can't he just try to change things? Why doesn't he know what to do in order to stop this war? I don't know. his prophecy vision isn't explained and it doesn't make sense. So then, later on in the book, his wife dies in childbirth, and Paul gets really sad, and with basically no build-up, he decides to follow the native tradition of this planet, which is anyone who's blind has to go walk into the desert and starve to death, which is a dumbass tradition, but Paul decides to do it because he's sad, and I guess it just proves that he belongs to that planet, even though he wasn't born there and didn't live there for the majority of his life. This book isn't a problem because Paul is no longer a positive character. It's a problem because the tragedy arc is so drawn out and frustrating, and it's a problem because the book doesn't really make any sense. It doesn't feel the same as the first book. It feels bad and pointless and like an unnecessary extension of the story. Also, I want to mention one more thing. Word choice is really important. I would suggest that unless you're talking about someone who is pregnant, that you not use the word pregnant. And if you would still like to, you're welcome to use it as a simile for, I don't know, stuff in nature or something. I don't care. But it is weird to say that somebody is feeling pregnant with emotions, especially when the somebody that you were talking about is a 16-year-old girl. I don't know why you would use that word. It has a lot of connotations, and it just confuses the entirety of what you're trying to say, and it's barely even poetic. Don't do that. As you may have gathered from the nonfiction section, I'm a bit of a science buff, and I like to listen to science podcasts sometimes. I believe it was... I can't remember exactly which podcast it was. It was either Science Diction or Undiscovered. It was one of the NPR science podcasts that I was listening to that mentioned this book and the whole story of the science behind it. I was really intrigued. I had been intrigued for a while, and eventually I decided to read this book to see how it used the super intriguing sci-fi concept that I was so enthralled by. And it used it poorly. This book barely counts as sci-fi. At the best, I would say that it counts as sci-fi about as much as that Dan Brown book with the super collider. Oh, I need to sneeze. Never mind. Both of them use random science doomsday weapons, the design and principles of which aren't actually relevant in any way to the plot, and that's very much what this book is. It spends a lot of time doing other things that are not related to the science, which I was only marginally interested in. I was kind of confused about the religion that was being told to me all throughout the book, mostly because, once again, there were a lot of made-up words which were in italics for some confusing reason. There was definitely humor in this book which was offensive, and it was actually not even funny, so I don't see why it was there. There was a whole lot of this thing that Kurt Vonnegut likes to do that I noticed in another book of his I read a few years ago, where he draws these weird connections between different events and references small moments earlier on in the book. It's a kind of repetition and symmetry that's a good literary device, and which he tries to utilize for humor, but once again, it's not actually that funny. It just makes the book feel a little weird and unreal, which that may actually be the point. It doesn't matter because I'm reviewing this as a sci-fi book, and it's a bad sci-fi book. I guess I should mention, what this book is about. The very clever science fiction concept in this book is something called Ice 9. Now, at the time that Kurt Vonnegut was writing this, his brother was working for, I want to say General Electric, working on a project to see if they could alter the weather. And one of the things that his brother was studying was crystallization. For instance, what kind of crystals should you drop into a cloud that will induce it to start forming snowflakes? Because of the crystal structure of water, some types of crystals are way more effective than others in order to do this. And I believe silver iodide is the most effective one that you can use to do something like this. But the point that Kurt Vonnegut was getting from this was, hey, what if there's a different form of ice which has a different crystal arrangement? For instance, ice 9 in a 9-sided crystal, instead of the 6-sided crystals that we get in ice and snowflakes. What if there was a different form of ice which was totally solid at room temperature, and which also acted as a seed for its own crystal? That means that if you drop a bit of this ice 9 into water, the rest of the water will immediately freeze into ice 9. Now, this is a super interesting sci-fi concept that I actually haven't seen explored in any other book of any type. I would love to, and if you know of any, please tell me, because I'd like to see it used. In this book, it's just used as a doomsday weapon that gets used irresponsibly for a little while by a scientist until it ends up in the hands of a dictator who kills himself with it, and then immediately plane crashes into his building and his body drops into the ocean, and the entire ocean freezes and the world ends. That's what this book is about. It's about it's about the weird personal interactions of the main characters up until and slightly after the world ends. And I'm not interested in the characters. They're all pretty much archetypes, and I'm not interested in the humor or the religion that's going on. But I am interested in the science, and I wish it could have been used in a more compelling way. On a recommendation from a friend of mine, I decided to try The Hunt for Red October, the Tom Clancy book about the Cold War and a Russian submarine that has mysteriously disappeared and is heading towards the US. This book was one of those rare cases where my determination to not DNF things ends up working out. Because I read the first few hundred pages of this book and I didn't really like it. I didn't see where it was going. I thought it was all very... I felt like I was being introduced to a lot of characters that I wouldn't see again, and that a lot was happening, but not a lot of it was very relevant. It was kind of frustrating to read. I didn't see where it was going. Then I got into the climax, and it was really good. I like the ending of this book. I think the ending is the most solid part, and I am in absolute awe of Tom Clancy's technical experience in a field that he never worked in his entire life. It just displays this guy's enthusiasm in such relief. It is honestly enjoyable to read about someone liking something, even if you don't like that thing. You can see the amount of work and effort that was put into this book, and that, at least, I can admire. I will say, there were almost no female characters in this book. There was the main character's daughter, who was there for one scene where he thought about beating her with a belt, and there was a female spy who was there in one scene. Now, granted, there were probably not a lot of women in the military in the 80s, but I bet you there were some, and I would have liked to have seen more. Also, this is meant to be a Jack Ryan book, despite Jack Ryan not being in it very much. He does some stuff at the end, but like in the majority of the book, he's just kind of helping out, and the people who actually get stuff done are other characters who don't get as much billing or appear as often or frequently. So, if you like Jack Ryan from TV or something, or if you've read other Jack Ryan books, this is barely a Jack Ryan book. The Martian by Andy Weir, which I really should have read a long time ago. The reason that I read it this year was because I also read Project Hail Mary this year, which I don't have with me, but imagine it's in my hand. Project Hail Mary was better, I would say, because it allowed Andy Weir to really show his sci-fi chops. He finally got to come up with some new sci-fi concepts, and it was really exciting to see how he wove those into the story and used them to solve and create problems later on. These are so fascinating because they're just complete problem-solving, puzzle-type books. Survival to the greatest extent. Both of them are characters whose expertise is not what you would necessarily expect to be helpful in the situation they're in. Nonetheless, they figure out a way to use that in order to keep themselves safe and, in the case of Project Hail Mary, to help basically the entire world as well. Both of these books were super cool, and I would highly recommend them, especially Project Hail Mary. I honestly don't really have much else to say about them because they were so good. I can barely find any criticism. Okay, there is one about The Martian. Well, that's infuriating. Which is that certain scenes are told in third person, and often when a scene starts in third person rather than being from Mark Watney's log, it indicates that something bad is about to happen. So for instance, there's a part where it starts narrating the journey of some fabric in third person, and then the fabric rips. Or then when it starts narrating something that happened to some rocks, and then the rocks collapse. Granted, this isn't necessarily a bad writing choice. It ups the suspense. The bad part is that it's not entirely consistent, and there are some third-person bits in here which I started getting very concerned about, but then it turned out nothing actually happened. Keep an eye out for those, and don't let yourself get too stressed reading these books. I think Andy Weir does a good job of keeping the stakes high and keeping you actually concerned without you totally knowing how the end is going to turn out. And for a survival story, where the end probably should be obvious, that's pretty impressive. I haven't actually read this book yet. It's just a stand-in for the book that I did read this year, which was Thunderhead, the second Scythe book. For many, many years, my childhood friends would tell me to read the Scythe books, and I just never bothered to. I don't know why, until 2022 when I read the first one. In 2023, I read the second one, Thunderhead, and to be honest, it was a while ago, so I don't remember too much about it. I remember liking it. I remember being very compelled. I read it in 1 or 2 days. And I remember that it is the only good piece of media that I have ever seen that nonetheless uses shark attacks as a major plot point. So, enjoy the book, and keep an eye out for the shark attacks. I really don't have that much to say. That's about it for what I read this year. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope something I said made you incensed, because at least then it would have been mildly entertaining. I'd like to make more videos, but I don't know what to make them about, so you're gonna have to comment and tell me, or I don't know what I'm gonna do. I have a long script written up for a video explaining warrior cats. I could be contracted to explain why the Michael Vey books are extremely bad. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. I could talk about any of the media I'm actually interested in. You can check my About Me page to find a list of the fandoms I'm interested in. Or I suppose I might make something about the structure of the murder mystery, from the perspective of someone who has no idea what they're talking about. That could be a fun video. I do hope you'll watch it. Bye! This video is sponsored by Ruin. The mountains that crush, the storms that crash, the waves that shatter, time infinite, the winds that weather, the storms that break, the timeless waves, running to the end of the sun, the ultimate destiny of all things, physical manifestation of entropy, and the end. I guess this is funny? Designer of really cool earrings. Thanks, Mom.